It was last winter, and I was living alone in a small neighborhood home. It was one of those places where everything beyond the backyard turned into trees and undeveloped land. I'd lived there for about a year by then, and never really had any issues. It was quiet, which I liked, and even though it was on the older side, it still felt like a nice, cozy home. This happened over a long weekend where it was snowing on and off, and extremely cold outside, often below zero, so I was at home and inside all day. This night, after eating dinner and cleaning up around the house, I watched TV for a bit and eventually turned everything off and went to bed around 11. One thing I have to mention about the bedroom is that for the last 3 or so months before this happened, the lock on my bedroom door had been broken. It was one of those push locks, and I just noticed one night that it didn't work. The door would still click open from both sides, but I had put it off for all that time because it just didn't seem important. I lived alone, so I didn't have family members or roommates that I was trying to keep out of my room. As long as all the main entrance doors were locked, my bedroom door really shouldn't matter. The hassle of buying a new one and changing it out just seemed really unnecessary. That being said, sometime later in the night, I woke up suddenly. My heart was beating quickly for some reason, and although the house was pitch black and quiet, I could faintly see that my bedroom door was cracked open. I could feel the alarms going off in my head, but at the same time, I knew there was a chance the door just didn't close properly and happened to make its way open. Maybe the cold winds slightly shifting the house caused it. I got out of bed and walked over, not wanting to turn the lights on, hoping I could just close it and get back to sleep. I shut it and double-checked it was latched in the doorway, then got back in bed. But as I laid there, I could tell something in me wasn't satisfied, like my gut knew there was more to this. I kept opening my eyes and looking around the room, although seeing nothing but shadows filling every corner. I probably stubbornly laid there, hoping to pass out eventually, for 30 minutes, before something moved in the house. I heard it, like a shuffle on the floorboards, either downstairs or in the hall outside my room. I leaned my body up and tried to listen, but there wasn't anything else. I was frozen, sitting up in my bed and not making a sound for a while. I was worried that if I got up and moved, then I wouldn't hear it again, or wouldn't be able to determine what it was. And eventually, I continued listening, but laid back down. I waited and listened for a long time, and don't even remember falling asleep. Didn't realize it until I woke up suddenly again, heart beating quickly just like before. And when my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw the same thing. My bedroom door was cracked open. I laid there staring at the gap in the doorway, looking at the darkness beyond it. Obviously, the hallway light was off, so it was just a deeper black outside of my room. I tried to tell myself it must have been the house again, or that maybe it didn't latch the way I thought it did. But that explanation didn't sit right this time, because I was very aware of how intentionally I closed it last time I got up. I started to get out of bed to walk over there again, but just as I swung my legs out of the covers, something shifted behind the door frame, like someone had moved out of the darkness between the crack in the doorway. I froze up again. I didn't hear anything though. No footsteps walking away. Nothing. Just the wind making the house creak. I didn't know if whoever the hell was right outside that door was still there, or if they were watching me, or what they were going to do. I stood motionless and quiet for 5 whole minutes, but it felt like hours, before I quickly ran to the door and slammed it closed, pressing all of my body weight into it to keep them out. But he didn't try to push it back open. There were maybe 15 seconds of silence, and then I heard soft, dull footsteps slowly move down the hallway and down the stairs. Sounded like he went toward the back door, and then it was quiet again. I quickly called the police, and thankfully I can say nothing else happened during the 10-ish minutes I waited for the police to make it and search the house. They took down a lengthy report of the whole night and everything I knew, which wasn't much, and they searched the home, but found nothing. However, as we were standing in the kitchen talking about what happened, I glanced toward the back door, explaining that's where I last heard his footsteps moving toward. And I saw him again. His silhouette standing in the trees behind my backyard. He moved away quickly before the officers could look. He was probably standing out there watching us through the windows from afar, which is insanely creepy and unsettling. I spent that night at a friend's house, as well as the next few days. Over the few weeks afterward, I didn't really get any more news from the police, but the snow cleared up a bit, and I found some even more unsettling things in the back forest behind my home. There were these faint and rugged trails through the woods, like from someone having walked the same way over and over, and the trail led right up to the back of my house. Whoever this guy was, he'd been stalking me for a while, long enough to have even naturally made a footpath in the forest. And probably the most disturbing find was that the way he broke in was likely through one of the back windows, which I found didn't lock correctly. Kinda like my bedroom door. Could just be a coincidence, but seeing as he'd been stalking me for a while, there's a chance that that night wasn't the first time he was in my house. And the broken lock on my bedroom door might have not been some random unrelated occurrence either. Needless to say, I moved out and far away from there. I just really hope I wasn't followed. I was somewhere in northern Oregon when it happened. I don't remember the exact highway. It wasn't one of the main ones, just one of those empty back roads surrounded by miles of dense forest. I'd been driving for hours, with the music low and the windows cracked to keep myself awake. This was supposed to be a pretty standard road trip, I guess, just seeing a few places, driving around, and clearing my head from all the noise. Nothing too exciting. I'd been paying relatively close attention to my gas gauge, checking every so often, and trying to fill it up when it was around a fourth of a tank. But I guess this time I pushed it too far. When the warning light came on, I figured I still had plenty of miles left to make it to the next gas station. I even checked my phone for the next station and put my directions on it, and it said 45 minutes away. Not ideal, but I thought I would still be fine. Definitely was slightly nervous though, seeing as there were no other closer options, even if I were to do a U-turn. Anyway, I kept driving, glancing down at my phone a while later and seeing it was at 35 minutes. Then I checked again maybe a few minutes later, seeing it still said 35 minutes. I remember staring at that number, wondering if it was even accurate anymore. Surely it was just an error or something. I checked another couple minutes later, and that's when I fully realized that the GPS wasn't updating at all. It was stuck at the 35-minute mark, and the little car icon wasn't moving either. I started messing with my phone, trying to reset the directions and clicking every button. But before I could get it working, my car sputtered. I felt my stomach drop. I hoped it was just a quick one-time thing from being low on fuel and not empty. Only got 30 seconds further before it sputtered again, and then again, and completely cut out. Wouldn't turn back on even in the slightest. I coasted to the shoulder of the road and sat there in silence for a minute, unable to believe the situation I knew I was in. I looked around at the place I'd ended up basically trapped at. The forest on either side of me was dark and lifeless. No lights at all, and a dense fog covering the top of the trees. It gave me chills as I sat there looking at it. I felt eerily alone. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but it took me about 10 seconds to see why my GPS had gotten stuck, and now why my calls wouldn't go through. I had no service, like zero service whatsoever. I put my head in my hands for a second, realizing how screwed I was, then got out of my car. I figured if my phone GPS had been frozen at 35 minutes for a while, I could have been just 10 to 15 minutes from the gas station. I mean, I had no way to know how long it was frozen for. If I was lucky, I could walk to the gas station and make it in half an hour or something. What other choice did I have anyway? I grabbed a small flashlight from the glove compartment, then manually locked the car with my key, and started walking down the road. It was empty and quiet, but not in the peaceful way. In the I can barely see anything through the fog and pitch darkness kind of way. The forest on either side of me was so unnervingly quiet and dark. Every time I glanced over, my eyes would be looking all around at the shadows that filled the areas between the trees, making every small thing look like something I knew it wasn't. It was just my imagination filling in the darkness with shapes that weren't there. So I tried to not even look. I kept my eyes forward, looking at the endless road ahead. My flashlight was nice to have, but it barely made it 10 feet in front of me with all the fog on the road. But about 5 minutes in, I heard something. It was a few cracks of branches, definitely not wind, or just trees swaying. It was something snapping a couple of branches, either by stepping on them or I don't know. I stopped walking. The forest went dead silent. I pointed my flashlight out there and stared into the darkness. The longer I looked though, the more uneasy I got, seeing those shapes again and knowing something could be out there looking back at me. Like if I continued to stare for too long, something would happen. So I looked away and kept walking, a little more rushed though, at least to get away from that area. A few minutes later, I noticed something on the right side of the road up ahead. At first, all I could see was a large shape laying near the trees. Thought it might have just been a fallen tree or something. But as I got closer and could get my flashlight to light it up a bit, I realized it was a car. An old beat-up sedan, halfway lodged into the forest, way past the shoulder of the road. But strangely, it didn't really look like it had crashed there. Looked more like whoever it was had driven it slowly down to the edge of the tree line, and then just left it there. The driver's side door was open slightly, and the car looked like it'd been there for a while, weeks or months even. And it was far enough off the road that unless you were walking along the secluded stretch like I was, then there was no way any cars passing by would notice it. Seeing that car lit up in my flashlight made me really disturbed. The thought that someone else had been here, maybe also run out of gas, or broken down or whatever. And whatever happened afterward clearly wasn't good if the car was still abandoned here. I didn't call out or shine my flashlight into the trees. I don't know why, but again I had this overwhelming feeling that if I looked for too long, something terrible would happen. And just when I thought that, and realized I needed to keep moving, there was another sound from the woods. A rustle in the bushes, near one of the trees behind the car. And then another. I turned instinctively toward the noise, and for a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks on me again. But no. I saw something. Not clearly, not faces or details. Just figures moving between the trees. More than one. A group of people running through the forest just outside of view. My whole body went cold. I started speed walking down the road. Not running. I almost had this instinctual thought that I didn't want to look like prey and show I was panicked by sprinting. But I walked faster than normal. I tried to act like I didn't hear the footsteps that started to match my pace in the forest. Multiple sets, crunching through the forest, following me along the tree line. I was genuinely too afraid to shine my light over there, or even look, scared of what I'd see. And somehow, through all of that going on, I never even heard or noticed a truck driving up behind me. Wasn't until the pickup truck stopped right next to me and a man yelled through the roll-down window that I got startled and realized he was even there. It was some regular-looking, dusty pickup truck, and the man looked maybe 50 with gray in his beard. He looked tired, but not necessarily threatening. "You stranded. What are you doing walking around out here? You're a long way from anything." I was so shaken, I just answered truthfully, saying my car ran out of gas and that I hoped I could walk to the nearest gas station. The man almost let out a short smirk, like I was crazy. "Hop in. I'll take you to the station. Think you're a lot further than you think you are." During this whole conversation, every sound and movement in the forest had stopped, and it was dead silent again. It was like everything paused for those 30 seconds. I hesitated, but decided to get in. Hitchhiking out there in the middle of nowhere was not something I ever thought I'd do, but the alternative of staying alone out there on the side of the road with whatever the hell was going on seemed worse to me. Felt like it was a risk either way. But it paid off. The old man really was just trying to help, and he seemed just as cautious as I was about the whole hitchhiking thing. He said he never offered rides, but that he lived on a farm an hour north and takes this road a lot, and had never seen someone like me wandering at night like that, and knew something could be really wrong. I didn't mention what I'd seen or heard out in the forest, not wanting to sound like an insane person. The drive to the gas station took way longer than I thought, nearly 25 minutes. Would have taken me hours to walk there, if I even made it past that forest. And when we got to the gas station, the man gave me a pat on the shoulder and wished me luck. That was it. No weirdness, no strange comments, just a guy helping someone out. I headed in and bought a gas tank, then took the clerk's advice to call the police to help me out, now that I had service. He said the sheriff's office around here was kind, and would give me a lift back to my car and make sure everything was okay. Thank God I did, because getting dropped back off at my car at night alone would have been awful. And when the cop drove me there, we found my car, except it had been moved. It was off the shoulder and on the edge of the forest, almost exactly like the other car I'd found out there. Someone, or that group, had pushed my car down there, like they didn't want anyone else to see it. That's when I told the officer everything. Anyway, that whole night became a mess, but to sum it up, the police wrote a report and did a bit of searching, but nothing came of it. No suspects, no nearby houses, and no one else had seen or heard anything. Even the other car they found had no plates on it or identifying information. There's really no saying what those people out in the forest were there for, or what they would have done if that pickup truck hadn't shown up exactly when it did. I had booked an Airbnb in spring of 2022. It was a small getaway cabin in a forest with several other identical cabins spread throughout the owner's land. There were some very faint trails or paths leading between all the cabins, but none of them were marked, likely only there from when the owner was building them and moving through the forest constantly. I had nothing exactly planned for this trip. It was only 3 hours from my home, and I just thought it'd be nice to spend some time away and hang out in the woods. I slept in on my second day, waking up at noon, making some coffee, and relaxing inside by the fireplace. Just before sunset, I threw on a hoodie and went out on a walk. I wasn't sure exactly where I was going. I was just following a thin path in the forest that was behind the cabin. I assumed it would take me to one of the other cabins though, and hopefully loop back around. At some point on this trail, once I was a bit deeper in the woods, I noticed some people standing out in the forest, maybe 200 or 300 yards out. Pretty far, but the way they were standing was odd. It was two men standing motionless and looking down at something on the ground. It didn't look like they were talking or really doing anything except looking at something on the forest floor. It was weird enough for me to sort of watch them as I kept moving along the trail, eventually getting too far to see them anymore. Had to be just two guys from the other cabins wandering the forest, and from my distance, it might have looked stranger than it was. At least, that's what I hoped. I kept walking for another few minutes, but I started to notice this trail wasn't really looping or curving at all. It was just going straight into the woods, nowhere near where the other cabins were. I think having seen those guys out there a few minutes ago, adding on with the trail seeming to not be what I thought it was, I felt like maybe I should just head back. Almost right when I started to think about it though, there was a sudden sound that caught me completely off guard. It came from behind me and sounded like some strange scream, or maybe animal call, kind of like an elk bellowing, but something about it felt unnatural. I turned around, but immediately froze. The two men were on the trail behind me, still really far, maybe 150 yards down, and they weren't moving. They were facing me though, maybe even staring at me. I couldn't tell from that distance. Honestly, whatever that sound was that I heard felt like it was too loud and unnatural for it to have been from them, even if it was them trying to mimic an animal sound or something. The sound I heard echoed through the whole forest and was nothing like anything I'd heard before. But why were the men here, following behind me? After standing there looking at them for about 10 or 15 seconds, I started taking a few steps back, and that's when they suddenly walked off the trail and into the trees. They continued until they were out of sight. I didn't really move for a few minutes, because I'd have to go down to where they were to get back to the cabin, so I wanted to make sure they were really gone. I definitely didn't want to go further down the trail either. After 5 minutes, and being pretty certain that they were away from the area, I hurried back down the path and got to the cabin. I thought about messaging the Airbnb host and asking if they knew anything about that path, or the two men, but I figured that might sound sort of strange and unnecessary. I kept it to myself, throwing some wood into the fireplace and taking a breather. The sun was mostly set by then, so the rest of the night I didn't plan on leaving the cabin. Not that I would have anyway, after what I saw out there. I made some tea and sat by the fireplace. After just a half hour, I felt much more comfortable and was able to actually start relaxing. However, I only got a short 15 minutes before I heard that sound again. The same one that I heard out in the woods. It was a bellowing scream that sounded like it was still pretty far out there, but I didn't know how much sound these cabin walls blocked out, so I couldn't say for sure how close it was. I got up and looked out the back window. I genuinely couldn't see anything except for the faint outlines of trees. It was way too dark out there. But the longer I stood there, the more unnerved I felt. A chill ran through my body as I pulled the curtains back over the window. I started looking up on my phone what that noise might have been. Maybe it was an animal sound that was common around here, and I just didn't know about it. I was never really a nature guy, so I wasn't knowledgeable enough to know. After a bit of research, I didn't find anything. The more I kept looking into it, the more creeped out I started to get, so I put my phone down and tried to not think about it. Another 30 minutes passed. I can't say that I did a good job at forgetting it, But through the crackling fireplace, I heard a few sudden footsteps on the doorstep at the front of the cabin. Boots thumping on the wood. They stopped right outside the door. My heart was pounding. A long 20 seconds passed before there was a slow knock at the door. I couldn't tell you how terrified I was as I crept up to the door and looked out the peephole. Standing right outside the door were two men. I assume the same ones I'd seen out in the woods. They had masks on, those cheap plastic animal masks that only cover the front of your face. They had hoods over their heads and looked nearly identical to each other. I immediately began dialing 911 and backing away from the door. I heard them knock again as I got through to the police. I tried to talk quietly, but I was pretty sure that they could still hear me. I only got halfway through explaining my situation when a sudden hard thud hit the door. For a moment, I thought they were about to break in, and I felt the most intense fear I'd never even come close to experiencing before. But after that thud, I heard their footsteps leave the doorstep. I managed to get back up to the door and look out, seeing both of them walking back into the woods. It took nearly 30 minutes before a cop arrived. He found a mark on the outside of the door, like the men had stabbed a knife into it before leaving. The cop took note of everything, but it was hard to tell if he believed me or not. I knew it sounded crazy though. I got out of there afterward, and obviously never went back to those same cabins. Every couple of months, I'll look up news in that area, expecting some strange disappearances to happen in those woods, but so far I haven't found anything. What the men wanted remains unknown to this day. I was taking a road trip with my good friend Carter to visit some other friends from college. The drive was pretty far, about 15 hours, but we thought with the both of us, we should be able to do it in one long go. I started driving first, then about 4 hours in, Carter took over. The plan was for me to sleep while he drove, but I genuinely couldn't. I don't know what it was, but I was never able to get comfortable. So by the time it was my turn to drive again, I was pretty tired, maybe even more so than I was before he took over. I was still able to keep my eyes open and pay attention to the road, but somehow I never noticed the gas tank getting really low. We were driving Carter's old Chevy, which didn't have the fancy tech to alert you when your tank is low. There was just a gas gauge that I never even looked at. Wasn't until the car started sputtering that I quickly realized we had nothing in the tank. Carter quickly woke up and started searching on his phone for the nearest gas station. But not even 30 seconds later, I had to pull off the highway because the car wouldn't accelerate anymore. I felt so stupid. Even worse, Carter said the closest gas station was 4 miles up the road. We were kind of in the middle of nowhere. It was just plains all around us, and there were no other cars on the road. We talked over our other options for a few minutes, but ultimately Carter decided he'd walk to the nearest gas station and bring back a canister, while I stayed and just watched the car. Maybe not the best plan, but it felt like a waste to call for help and have to pay $200 just for some gas, when the station was still within a walkable distance. Although it was 1 a.m. and dark outside, Carter didn't seem bothered as he left the car and started heading down the road. Within a minute, he was out of sight. I sat back and basically just thought about how stupid I was for getting us in this situation. But just a couple minutes later, I saw headlights coming down the road from up ahead. They came down and passed by, but they were going much slower than they should have been. I think the speed limit was 55 or 60, and they passed by going maybe 15 or 20. I watched in the side mirror, and they didn't speed up after passing. They slowed down even more, eventually stopping and doing a 3-point turn to come back around. Honestly, I didn't want to admit I was out of gas, or needed help, or anything. And I didn't have to. They came back down the road and passed by, even slower this time, like maybe 5 miles per hour, probably staring through the windows at me, before picking up speed and heading back the way they initially came from. What was that about? I kept my eyes glued to the road for the next few minutes, waiting to see if they came back around or not. I had a pretty bad feeling about it. Maybe it was just my gut, but I started to think something could go pretty wrong soon. I got my phone out and called Carter. I just wanted to let him know, and maybe to hurry up if possible. But the phone rang all the way through. He didn't pick up. That definitely made me worried, but maybe he just had his phone on silent, or lost service along the road. I waited a minute, then called again. Still nothing. At this point, I definitely wasn't being rational, but I made the decision to ditch the car and try to catch up with Carter. I think it'd only been 10 or 15 minutes since he'd walked away, so if he was still walking, surely I could jog and catch up in just a few minutes. I got out and made sure to lock the car, then started jogging down the side of the road. It was real quiet out there. So quiet that every time I took a break from running, I'd notice the ringing in my ears, only because there was not even the slightest sound to drown it out. I jogged for 15 minutes. I thought I would have caught up to Carter by then, unless something made him start jogging or running for some reason. I decided to pull out my phone and call him once more, and it was just then that I heard the sound of it ringing. It was very faint, in the distance, somewhere off the side of the road. I looked out at the nothingness past the shoulder of the road, and just barely, I could see a light glowing in the grass. My body tensed. "Carter?" He didn't respond. I couldn't see anything at all, aside from the dim phone screen glowing. I took a few steps off the road and into the grass, calling out again. Finally, I got a response. I could faintly hear Carter's voice coming from somewhere near where the phone was, but I couldn't tell what he was saying. I hurried closer, and Carter yelled again, and this time I could hear he was telling me to get down. I still couldn't even see him yet, but I did what he said, ducking in the grass. And that's when I looked back and saw a car coming down the road. I immediately knew it was the same one I'd seen, moving slowly, just like before. They were looking for us, or Carter, I guess. They made 3 or 4 turnarounds, slowly passing the area and very obviously searching for us. Once it seemed like they finally left, we got up and booked it to the gas station. Carter explained that the guy initially pulled over and tried to get him to get in his car. He said he was extremely creepy and really didn't hide the fact that he had bad intentions. After Carter refused, the man stepped out of his car, and Carter instantly took off running. I guess the guy thought he'd just continue running down the road, so he got back in his car to chase him, but Carter ran off the road, jumped in the grass, and just hid. At some point, his phone flew out of his pocket, and he was too scared to get up and reveal himself, so he just stayed hidden. Anyway, we got to the gas station and were able to get help. We also told the police about the guy, describing his car and everything, but they never found him. It was very much a horrifying close encounter, and I feel really bad even still for being the reason we were put in that situation. One thing's for sure though, I'll never forget to fill up the gas tank ever again. Just last year, I'd gotten a promotion at my job. It wasn't too much extra pay, but part of the new position would have me traveling a ton to different locations all over the states. I was single and really had nothing else going on at the time, so I was really excited to travel. As for where I'd stay, it was always pretty random. Sometimes hotels, sometimes resorts, and every once in a while a small Airbnb. I'm not sure why they switched it up every time. but I thought it was interesting at the very least. Anyway, this week I was heading to a new town to visit their department of the company, and I was booked for an Airbnb nearby. I'd already had the promotion for 8 months at this point, and had gotten fairly used to it, so the excitement of seeing where my next stay was at had kinda died out. Once the plane landed, I got my rental car and started heading to the address of the Airbnb. I noticed right off the bat, though, it was farther than usual from where the company building was. Usually, if it was an Airbnb, it would be because it was very close to where the site was. But I think this time, the drive took 40 minutes. And when I arrived at just about 1 a.m., I thought there was a mistake. The place was huge. I mean, at least 4,000 or 5,000 square feet, with a huge yard and everything. I had to triple check this was the right place, and it was. I got everything inside, and I have to say, although the outside looked really nice, it definitely didn't look quite as good on the inside. Maybe just a bit old-fashioned for my taste. Still, I couldn't complain. There was a ton of space, way more than I could ever use. After the long flight, I was too tired to explore the entire place right away. I just brought up all my stuff to the bedroom, turned off the lights, and got in bed. As I laid there, I noticed how creaky the house was. It felt like it was making a lot of noise. Nothing concerning, but just these creaks and thumps in the walls. I thought it must have been just how bigger houses were. I mean, I wouldn't be one to know. I don't think I'd ever been in a house this big. But unfortunately, I'm a pretty light sleeper, so the constant noises kept me up long enough to realize I needed some water. I hadn't even eaten or drank anything since the flight. Sort of frustrated that I had to get up, knowing it'd only make it harder to sleep, I tiredly got out of bed and headed through the long hallway and down the steps to the kitchen. Strangely, once I was downstairs, all the creaks and thumps I'd been hearing for the last hour were gone. Like at some point between me getting up and moving from the bedroom to the downstairs hallway, all the sounds stopped. It was one of those moments that had me scratching my head, like what were the chances of that? Anyway, I grabbed a glass of water, not even bothering to turn on any of the lights, and headed back upstairs. I was able to fall asleep after that, as the rest of that night, I didn't hear any more sounds or noises. In the morning, I only spent maybe 30 minutes there, waking up late and still tired, but having to rush out of the house to get to work. After being at the office all day, I went out with a couple guys from work to get drinks, so I actually didn't get back to the Airbnb until sometime past 11 p.m. I headed inside and sat on the sofa, relaxing for a minute. I was exhausted, but I remembered I still hadn't yet checked out the rest of the house. It felt almost mandatory to at least give it a look around, so I got up and just casually walked through the rooms. Walking through it, I honestly couldn't think of much use for an Airbnb this large. I even got so curious that I looked it up to see how much it was, finding it was actually priced the same as other much smaller places in the area, which I found to be a little odd. Also, it looked like some parts of the house weren't reset from the last guest. It looked clean, but some pillows were all over the couch, and some of the chairs and stuff were just in random places. It kinda looked like someone had just been here. And the most strange thing was that one of the kitchen chairs was pulled out. I was in there for a minute earlier that morning and never sat down, and I could have sworn all the chairs were pushed under the table before. Must have just overlooked it, I thought. I pushed it back under the table. After the quick 5-minute tour of the house, I figured it best to take a shower and head to bed for the night, as I had another long day tomorrow. I turned off all the lights, went upstairs, showered, and got in bed. I was just on the verge of falling asleep when a familiar sound suddenly came from below me. It was those creaks. They suddenly started again. The fact that I was just about to fall asleep made it 100 times more obnoxious. I sat up and listened, And even though I was annoyed, a part of me felt like it didn't sound like your typical house noises, so it made me a little uneasy as well. I started to think I could make out individual footsteps walking around under me, and maybe even cabinets being opened and closed. I couldn't tell if it was just my mind making up things, though. I got up and quietly opened the door. The sounds didn't stop this time. I could clearly hear them from the hallway. I carefully walked down and up to the stairs, which were wooden and kind of creaky, and as soon as I took a step, everything went quiet. My heart started racing. I moved to the bottom of the steps and looked down the hall. I could tell a light in the kitchen was on. I swore I turned off all the lights before going to bed, but there was still a small chance I just forgot about that light. I quietly walked down the hall and looked in the kitchen. My eyes widened. That chair in the kitchen was pulled out again, like someone had just been sitting there. Only a second after seeing that, I saw something else behind the chair. In the far back room, where all the lights were off and it was nearly pitch dark, a figure was peering around the corner, watching me. We held eye contact for a moment as I completely froze up before they jolted back behind the corner. A few seconds later, I heard a door slam shut. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I ran up to that corner and flicked on the lights, searching around for a second to see where he went or if he was gone. But I didn't see him. I didn't even see what door he possibly could have gone through that I'd so clearly heard him slam shut. I ran upstairs, got my phone, and sprinted out of the house. I drove away and called the police. As far as what was going on in there, I'm afraid that I got very few answers. The host and the police talked for a while, but the host felt like he wasn't taking me seriously, or like he thought I was lying. Maybe he just didn't want to be responsible. But in all fairness, I had no proof of anything. I wasn't even able to see what the guy looked like. And the host claimed that there were no doors where I'd supposedly heard the man run and slam a door from. Everything just felt really weird about the whole situation after the fact. My company was nice enough to just move me to a hotel for the rest of the week, but honestly, I was pretty shook for the rest of that trip. Had I stayed in that house any longer with whoever was in there with me, I'm afraid that things could have gone a lot differently. I was 28, living alone in a small city after getting laid off from my longtime job. That job was the only reason I even moved to this city to begin with, so this was pretty devastating. I really wasn't sure which direction I wanted to go with my life, but while I tried to think about things, I figured I'd get any job I could, just to pass the time. After a few weeks of searching, I got an offer from a small motel on the edge of the city. I went in for a few short days of training, but this happened on essentially my first full night alone at the motel working the counter. This motel was a pull-off on the highway, about 30 minutes outside the city. There wasn't anything else out here. The only other building was an abandoned restaurant next to the motel. Through the first few hours of the night, a couple customers came in. They got a room and I checked them in, and that was about it. A lot of the customers looked the same, tired and in need of rest, but one lady stood out to me. She looked really tired too, but she kept looking over her shoulder and was really rushing to get a room. Wasn't sure what that was about, but I only interacted with her for maybe a minute, then she went to her room. Then there was a long time where I was alone. I just sat behind the counter, staring out the doors at the empty highway. Barely any cars even passed by, so I figured the night would be really slow. That was until a man walked in. I never saw his car pull into the motel, so I thought he must have been a customer that had checked in earlier before my shift had started. However, he made it clear right away that that wasn't the case. He asked how much the rooms were, and if any were available. "Yeah, we have plenty of rooms. Did you want me to check you in for one tonight?" He looked like he thought about it for a second, but his eyes kept glancing beside me. Eventually, he responded no thanks and walked out. After he left, I looked over my shoulder, trying to figure out what he kept looking at. The only thing over there was the key wall. That's what I called it anyway. Basically, it was just a bunch of pockets holding the keys to the rooms. This was an old-fashioned place, not having the fancy key cards that all the hotels have nowadays. Anyway, when he walked out, I kept my eyes on the door, wondering if I'd see his car drive away, but I didn't. I thought it was extremely weird, because there was almost no way he walked here. He would have had to walk along the side of the highway at night for a stretch of probably 10 miles from the nearest place, which was just a gas station. After a minute, I walked over to the door and looked out at the parking lot. It was very quiet. Only the few cars from the previous customers were in the lot, and the man was nowhere to be seen. With nothing else out there, I closed the door and went back behind the desk. The night was going by very slow, and because it was my first night alone, the owner told me to just focus on check-ins and check-outs, and didn't give me anything else to do. A half hour went by, when the sudden desk phone ringing startled me. I quickly picked it up, seeing it was one of the rooms calling. A woman's voice came through. She was clearly in distress, as she explained that someone was standing outside her door and wouldn't leave. I quickly got up, and immediately when getting outside, I could see that whoever it was, they weren't there anymore. I hurried up to the woman's room, which was on the far end. When she answered, she looked really nervous. I asked if she knew the guy, or if he said anything, and apparently the man didn't speak at all. She saw him outside her window and asked him to leave, but the man wouldn't, and that's when she called. When the woman described him, though, I immediately knew who she was talking about. It was the guy from earlier. She described him exactly as I remembered he looked like. Kind of tall, and really dead-looking eyes. Now, I asked her if she wanted me to call the police, but she was very adamant about me not calling authorities, saying she didn't want to deal with any of that and was leaving in the morning anyway. She just wanted me to tell them to leave if I saw them. So that was it. I went back to the main room. For the next 2-ish hours, I thought a whole lot about the situation. Like, what was the guy doing here anyway? And why was he standing outside the room? I thought he might have been drunk, though when he came in earlier, I didn't get that feeling. Whatever the case, in the middle of the night, I suddenly heard some commotion. It sounded like a bunch of stuff getting knocked over, and thuds against the walls that radiated through the whole motel. I quickly ran out the door. From there, I saw the woman's door at the end was wide open, and the noise was coming from inside her room. I ran over. Looking through the doorway, I could see the woman being cornered in the room, with the man standing in front of her, blocking her from leaving. I yelled, but I was so full of adrenaline, I don't even know what I said. He instantly turned around and looked at me. His face was full of anger, and his eyes were bloodshot. After seeing that, I was terrified. He came barreling toward me, and I just backed out of the doorway, but he ran straight past me. I saw him run out into the highway, and then disappear into the woods on the other side. I quickly made sure the woman was okay, and thankfully I'd gotten there before he'd been able to do anything to her. I then went back to the office and called 911. Turned out, after the man was standing outside her door, he went around the building and into the front room while I was checking on her, and he stole the spare room key from the wall. But it also turned out the woman lied to me. She knew that guy. It was her ex-husband that she was actually running away from, which was why she needed to stay at the motel, and probably why she was so on edge. She said he was pretty unhinged and had violent episodes. I guess earlier, when I asked if she wanted me to call the police, she lied, hoping he would just go away without making things complicated. I'm not really sure, to be honest. That night was definitely one to remember, though, and not in a good way. I can't help but think how things could have gone differently, or what would have happened if he didn't just run away. Who knows what he was capable of. Surprisingly, I kept the job and stayed there for a few months. But it got really uncomfortable, having to deal with really strange people pretty much every night, so eventually I got out when I could. This was back in 2022. I'd been looking for extra ways to make money on the side, and had downloaded DoorDash, thinking I'd try it out. I got accepted and had it all ready for me to start working, but I didn't finally decide to try making some deliveries until 3 weeks later. I just kept pushing it off. It was a night after getting home from work where I was just bored, but not yet tired, and thought there was no better time than now to test it out. The first few orders, I was still getting the hang of things, but they all went well. I felt confident after that, as it was a pretty simple process. It was around 3 hours in, and I think just past 12 a.m., when an order popped up that was different from all the rest. It had a massive estimated tip of something like $30 to $40. That was just about as much as I made in the last 3 hours of working. I didn't even think twice before quickly accepting the order. It was from a 24/7 McDonald's, the only one in our whole town. It was right on the edge of the highway that led out of town and into what I considered to be the middle of nowhere. Once I picked up the order, I realized that was exactly where the order was taking me. I didn't make it 2 minutes down the road before getting a call from the DoorDash customer. He sounded older than me, like maybe in his 30s, and he didn't seem to be in a good mood as he told me to confirm the address. A little confused, I just read off the address the app was taking me to. After I said it, there was a pause. The man didn't say anything. I was gonna ask if it was correct or not, but he hung up right away, without saying a word. I thought it was pretty odd that he was clearly in a bad mood and didn't respond to me, all while offering a huge tip, as if he were a nice guy. Maybe it was because he wanted me to take extra care of his order, but even that seemed excessive. Whatever the case, I just kept driving. I was about 15 minutes away, but it felt like I was driving really far because of the road going directly away from town. There were some smaller, random neighborhoods here and there, but it looked like mostly empty farmland, or single homes off the side of the road. As I kept driving, I got a strange, unsettling feeling about this delivery. Might have been from the unknown area, or the empty and foggy road, or the odd phone call, but I definitely felt like something was different about this order. Pulling off the road and onto the dirt driveway didn't make me feel any better. I couldn't see much through the dense fog, but I was driving through a tall grass field with no vision of what was at the end. I drove slowly until finally getting to the house. It was sitting by itself in the middle of the field, one of those old farm-looking houses with a large wraparound porch and wooden accents. Lights were on in the windows, and I could see that the large address numbers matched the address I had on the order. I parked and got out with the food, beginning to walk up to their front door. It was hard not to notice how quiet it was out there. No sounds whatsoever, except for the slight breeze cutting through the tall grass. I didn't even hear anything inside the home, like a TV or people talking. I went to knock on the door, and on the first knock, the door creaked open, like it wasn't fully closed. Immediately, a man's voice called out from the back of the house. It was the same guy from the phone. He asked if I was the DoorDash driver. I said yeah, and that I would just leave his order right here on the porch. but the guy quickly responded and asked if I could set it down inside on the countertop in the kitchen. Again, I noticed he sounded pretty upset, or just in a bad mood for some reason. I took a few steps inside. The house had the smell of old wood, kind of musty, like it wasn't very clean. Within a couple seconds, the man suddenly turned on music. It came from the back, right where I heard his voice come from. It was this old piano song, and was really loud. It kind of freaked me out.
Sir?
I called out.
Hello?
He wasn't responding anymore. I started to feel like maybe this wasn't worth it, even for the tip he offered. Everything just wasn't feeling right. Like, why the hell did he just start blasting piano music while I was walking into his house, and just stop responding? Once I was closer to the end of the hallway where the kitchen was, I could see it getting darker. Like the other rooms next to the kitchen, notably the one I thought the guy was in, was fully dark. I stopped walking, dropping the bag on the ground and just hurrying back toward the front door. I nearly had a heart attack, as right when I got close to the door, I saw the guy standing in the dark just a couple feet from it. I distinctly remember the whites in his eyes, almost glowing, as he stared at me with wide eyes. It was like I caught him in the act of something. That split second felt like it lasted minutes, and even thinking about it now, I could have sworn there was something in his hands, but I never directly looked at it, so I can't say for sure what it was. Before anything could happen, I sprinted outside, got in my car, and drove through the fog back to the road. I'm certain, from the way the guy was standing, he was trying to sneak to the front door, probably to close and lock me inside with him. Now that I think about it, that probably explains the music, muffling the sound of him creeping through the house as I walked down the hallway. That night, I deleted the app and never looked back. I definitely made some questionable decisions that I'm not proud of, but I don't think I deserved whatever that guy was going to do to me, had I been just a few seconds late and been locked inside with him. Last fall, my sister went on a trip over Halloween weekend. It was for some sort of party she was going to, but she was flying there, so taking her dog Milo wasn't really that convenient. She'd be gone for only a couple days though, and I offered to watch Milo while she was away. The apartment I lived in didn't allow pets, so rather than bringing Milo to my place, I just stayed at her house for the weekend. I packed my work laptop and some other random things I might need, then headed 30 minutes down to the house in the morning. Just an hour after arriving, my sister left for her trip. Now, Milo was a really easy dog to look after. I'd done this a bunch of times before. He was super sweet and wasn't all that loud either, despite being a German Shepherd. He was getting older, so most of the time he just hung out in whatever room I was in and relaxed while I worked. So I set my laptop up in one of the spare bedrooms and started my workday. Milo laid in his doggy bed right next to my desk, just out of the corner of my view. There wasn't much going on for several hours, aside from me working, but oddly, throughout the day, he kept perking his head up. Usually I'd assume it was just a dog being a dog, hearing something small that was really nothing. But this was different. He was sure he'd actually heard something, because he wouldn't just go right back to sleep. Milo's head would raise and his ears would perk up, and he'd stare at the doorway for a whole 5 to 10 minutes. It happened enough for me to get up at one point and look around the house. Milo followed me as I did. He stayed right by my side, focused, like he was also searching for something. I never found or saw anything, but it definitely gave me an off feeling. I think I finished working around 5 or 6. Being fall, we had about an hour before it got dark and cold, so I hooked Milo up to his leash and took him out behind the house on a walk. My sister got lucky with this place, basically having a forest-preserved trail right behind it. But this time of year, all the trees along the path were already stripped of leaves, and basically just dead looking. It actually made it feel a bit spooky, with it being later in the afternoon. It was also really quiet out there, just me and Milo walking, crunching all the dry leaves on the trail. I knew the trail was about a 20-minute loop, and we went down just about halfway, when suddenly Milo stopped. Like, just completely stopped in place. I looked at him, asking if he was okay, and tugging on the leash, but he wouldn't budge. He wouldn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on something ahead of me. I turned and looked down the trail, but I didn't see anything. I looked back down at Milo and pet him, then gently tugged the leash forward again, but he still wouldn't move, and his gaze was still fixed at something down at the end of the trail, further in the forest. So I just turned and began heading back. Milo then immediately followed. The rest of the walk to the house, he kept looking back, but never once stopped to sniff or anything. He just kept his tail down and followed next to me all the way back to the house. It made me feel really nervous, seeing him being nervous. I wasn't so sure though whether it was him I was nervous about, or about whatever he was so scared of. I ended up calling my sister and talking to her for a bit after getting back inside, asking if she might know why he was acting like this, but she had no clue. Even throughout that phone call, Milo was attached to my side. It made me feel unsettled or uneasy, like he was aware of something that I wasn't. I started walking the house again as I thought about it, and casually looked out a few of the windows, but it wasn't until I got back upstairs to the spare bedroom that I looked out that window and saw something weird. It was just for a moment, but I thought I saw someone out there. Right near the house, someone walking from left to right, disappearing past the edge of the window before I could get a good look. It was almost like when you see something in the corner of your eye, and you think you know what you saw, but when you look, you realize it was nothing. So I couldn't say whether what I saw was real, or just my mind playing tricks because I was so unsettled. I stayed up in that room, sitting at the desk and trying to take it easy for the rest of the night. I watched some videos on my laptop and kept an eye on Milo. He stayed quiet, laying near me and seeming exhausted from the day. For the next 2 or so hours we were up there, nothing much happened. Milo was passed out, and I was just watching YouTube and trying to relax. Even with all the strangeness going on, I was able to sort of separate my mind from it. Not that I totally forgot about it all, but I guess I thought it just wasn't anything serious. Once it was late, I started getting ready for bed and brought Milo downstairs to let him outside one more time. I opened the back door and flicked on the lights. Milo was hesitant, but still went out. As he did his business, I looked around. The woods around the house were quiet and eerie. I watched Milo walk toward the trees, then stop and turn. Not to face me, but he was staring at something at the side of the house. I peered around the doorway and looked. Within seconds, all I saw was a man charging toward me. I jumped back and Milo started sprinting at him. The guy looked horrified for a second, stopping dead in his tracks and trying to dodge the dog. I thought Milo was actually about to attack the guy for a moment, but at the last second he backed off and started barking and growling while listening to my voice and running back inside. I closed the door and locked it, and before I could see anything else, the guy was gone. Just like that, in a matter of seconds, everything was quiet again. I quickly called 911. To be fully honest though, the cops were no help at all. They shined their lights around, but that was about it. However, as we were talking about what had happened, I was playing around with the door and happened to find that the lock on the back door actually didn't work. The lever would click and everything, but it would still open. My sister was sure it was never like that before. That night, I took Milo to a hotel, and we spent the next day there. Based on Milo's behavior, I think the guy was probably watching us all day, and even following us out in the woods on our walk. But also, there's a chance he had been inside the home before, maybe even during the day while I was working. I keep thinking back to how Milo was constantly looking at the doorway, and the lock on the back door not working seems to be a really big coincidence. But Milo definitely startled him, enough to get us both inside safely and scare him away. I'm actually quite surprised though, because my sister hasn't had anything weird happen, or any encounters since then. It almost makes me think that the man wasn't there for her. Maybe he'd been watching me for longer than I knew, and found out I'd be alone at a house in the woods, rather than safely up in my apartment building with other people around. And so he thought it'd be his best chance to do whatever he was trying to do. Probably something horrible. Can't say for sure, but I've been on edge ever since. A couple years ago, I was working as a Lyft driver. Uber as well, but in my town, Lyft was more popular, so that's what I stuck with. Anyway, because of the freedom of the job, I never managed to get myself to follow a schedule. At the time, I was in my mid-20s, and sometimes stayed up late hanging out with friends, or doing whatever, so it would cause me to stay up late on the days I'd choose to work, and do long shifts overnight. This night started just the same as any other. I started around 11ish and did a couple of drop-offs before getting another pickup to do. Now, working these late shifts, I couldn't be picky at all with who or what requests I accept. I was usually one of the only drivers working that late, and there were also usually barely any people needing rides. If I were to miss out or not accept a single ride, it would cost me. So I was kind of on autopilot. Every time a request would come through, I'd instantly accept it and start heading there, and only then would I look a bit more into it, like how far they were or where I was dropping them off at. It never made any difference, because 99% of the time it was just to pick up someone from a party, a bar, or an office after working past the train hours. So when this request came in, I did the same as always, accepting it and heading en route to their pickup location. It wasn't until I'd say about 10 minutes into the drive that I realized it was taking me in a different direction than usual. Not toward the main town square, with all the stores and offices and whatever. So I checked where exactly I was going, and the location was a little unusual. Of course, I was driving, so I couldn't look too into it, but from a few quick glances at the map, it didn't really look like anything was out there. I thought it was definitely strange, but I wasn't going to cancel or anything. I arrived there 15 minutes later. I think it was about 1 or 2 a.m. by this point in my shift, and the place was just what it looked like on the map. Just a very isolated location with literally nothing. No houses, side roads, trails, or paths. I was thinking maybe the guy's car had broken down or something, but even then, I didn't see anything or anyone. I pulled off the side of the road and notified the customer, then waited a while. I never got a response or saw anyone outside, and with a bad feeling starting to build up in me, I decided to cancel it and drive away. Definitely sucked wasting my time like that, but it is what it is, just part of the job sometimes. I began driving back toward the center of town, because I knew that's where I'd most likely get more pickups from. But just 5 minutes after starting to drive back, I got another order. It was from almost the exact same place I was just at, but maybe a mile further down the road. Despite this seeming really suspicious, it actually wasn't at all to me. This happened every once in a while, where the location was just off or there was a mistake, and so after I'd decline it, the customer would reorder it right away. and usually the location would fix itself and everything would go smoothly the second time around. I didn't know why the customer didn't just reply to my messages, but whatever. I accepted it, actually glad this whole drive wasn't going to be a waste of time now, and turned around to go back. I passed the previous spot and went a mile further. Again, the whole road was empty and had nothing but sparse forested land on either side. However, this time, when I got to the new location, there was a man standing there on the side of the road. He wore regular jeans and a gray hoodie, and had a backpack or duffel bag slung on his shoulders. As I parked in front of him, I looked behind him and saw nothing that he could have come from. No houses or anything. I wasn't sure how he could have gotten here, or what he was doing out here. He opened the door and got in. The drop-off spot he had marked on the map was only 5 minutes down the road. I hoped it was at somewhere that made more sense, but from the look of things, it was in just as barren a place as I picked him up from. As I drove, the man stayed quiet in the back seat, but he was looking at me a lot. Every time I'd glance in the mirror, his eyes were already on me. I felt an unsettling tension, and with how odd the situation already was beforehand, I started to overthink everything. Like, why were we out here, where he came from, and what he had in the duffel bag. All things I normally wouldn't care about, or even bother to think about. A few minutes later, I got to the drop-off spot that was marked on the map. It was nearly identical to the place I picked him up at. Nothing was around there at all. The silence after pulling up, both of outside and my passenger, had just started to give me a really horrible sense, and before I could say anything, the man told me to get out of the car. I looked back at him in fear to confirm what he just said, finding he already had a gun pointed right at me, and an uncanny, dead look in his eyes as he pointed at the door and repeated himself. I had no choice. I got out, and he followed, going up behind me and telling me to walk. He stayed several feet back, far enough to keep me from trying anything, and he led me off the road and into the forest. I tried to say whatever I could. I was truly terrified and fearing for my life. The man stayed quiet though, not responding, or showing any bit of remorse for what he was doing. We walked deeper and deeper in. It started to get more dense with trees, and a lot darker. Time didn't feel like it moved at a regular pace during this whole thing, but I think we walked for 10 full minutes, just going straight into the depths of this forest. But he suddenly said to stop. I stopped in place and could feel my time coming to a close. I was moments away from never being seen again, and my adrenaline flooded my body and just decided to take a chance and bolt deeper into the trees. He yelled stop again, but I just kept running. I used the darkness to my advantage, knowing that because he dragged me so deep into the woods, once I was farther away, he'd have trouble seeing me. I knew he was chasing though, because his voice followed behind me, not fading out. And then, suddenly, there was a gunshot. It rang through the whole forest, and the silence following it was deafening. That was it. He wasn't chasing me anymore. I think he must have fired it out of rage, or just to scare me, knowing I'd already escaped. From that point forward, I just walked in whatever direction. My phone, of course, was still in the car, so I was on my own. After a while, I found a small road with a few houses on it, and was able to get some guy to answer and help me. My car, and everything in it, was gone by the time officers were searching the area. Although, I don't think this was just a simple robbery. In fact, I'm not even sure that's what he initially planned to do. Unfortunately though, they never found any traces to lead them to him. Even the account he used on the app ended up being a dead end. I worked as a driver for another few months, but during that time, I got a couple more pickup requests near that spot that all this went down at, and every time I called the police, only for them to show up and find nobody there. Eventually, I realized I was so schizo and paranoid about it that I just found a different gig. I was spending the weekend alone at my cabin-style house on the edge of town. It wasn't isolated in the middle of nowhere. There were other houses around, but they were spaced out enough that you could go days without seeing anyone around. I never got visitors, like solicitors or neighbors. The houses in this neighborhood were the kind people drove past without even thinking about it, because unless you looked intently, you probably just saw an endless forest of trees. It was winter, right after a heavy snowfall, so everything felt quieter than usual. A thick blanket of snow covered the whole area, and the woods behind my house looked deeper and darker than they usually did. I didn't mind being alone out there for the most part. The house was cozy, with lots of big windows, a stone fireplace, and just overall that nice cabin feeling. It was the whole reason I moved there. The first night, nothing weird happened until late. I stayed up watching YouTube videos in the living room, kind of half asleep by midnight. After a while, I turned off the TV and headed to my room. It was a one-story home, so my bedroom sat right at the end of the hallway. The thing about the bedroom is that it matched the rest of the home, having these massive floor-to-ceiling windows along the wall, and even a sliding glass door that opened toward the woods. Because the home was in a private location, with just the woods on all sides and no close neighbors, it made sense, I guess. But it did feel strange sometimes. Even just seeing my reflection in the glass at night would startle me, thinking someone was standing out there. But this night was different. As I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, I heard something. This soft cracking sound coming from outside. Not like an animal or the typical forest noise. This was louder, like someone stepping on a thick branch. A couple seconds later, it happened again. I sat up and looked toward the large window. Because the lights were off in my room, I could see outside through the glass pretty well. I stared for maybe 30 seconds before something moved in the solid darkness between the tall pine trees. Not a shape I could describe, just a quick shift of a shadow between two trees, like someone leaned out of view, or leaned into view. I couldn't tell. Everything was still after that. After minutes of waiting and staring out there, feeling nerves building up in me, I started to think I might have just imagined it, like my eyes were just seeing shapes in the dark. But I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, though, I got up and double-checked the sliding door was locked, then got back in bed. After that, it took me forever to fall asleep. Every 30 seconds, I felt like I had to open my eyes and look out the window again. But every time, I saw nothing. The next day was strange. Nothing outright happened, but everything felt off in a way I couldn't explain. I'd constantly get that subtle, uneasy feeling, like someone was standing just out of sight, staring in. I kept glancing at whatever window was behind me, half expecting to see eyes looking in. I never did, but the feeling didn't go away. As it got later and became dark again, snow began coming down again, which eased my senses a bit. I think it made it even more unlikely anyone would be outside lurking around when it was cold and snowy, so I tried not to overthink. Around 10, I was watching TV in the living room, wrapped up in a blanket by the fireplace. The glow of the TV screen lit up most of the house, so I didn't even realize how dark it was inside until I left the couch to get a soda. And as I walked through the main hallway, I noticed the light in the far room. The small den with bookshelves was off. I could have sworn I left it on earlier. I usually always kept it on because it provided a nice ambient light, so the house didn't feel like a shadowy cave. I went over and quickly flipped the light back on, figuring nothing of it, and getting my soda and sitting back down. I was maybe back on the couch for a minute, having just unpaused the TV, when I happened to glance over my shoulder. I wasn't even trying to check anything. It was just one of those automatic glances you do for no reason. But the light in the room was off again. I could feel the blood rush from my face. I stood up and walked down the hallway, just enough to see the switch from where I was standing. The switch was in the off position, physically flipped down. I just stared at it. Someone was in that room, and it was like they were trying to lure me in there. I started to back away. My phone was charging on the nightstand in my room, and my car keys were by the front door. I knew I needed to get both and leave immediately. I quietly moved to the other hallway and into my bedroom, grabbing my phone, but not before seeing something shift behind the glass. I looked up, and at first all I saw were faint footprints going through the snow behind the window, until it led my eyes to a large figure. A man, standing just a couple feet behind the window. He was entirely covered by the dark, but I knew he was looking in at me. I sprinted back down the hall toward the front door, getting my keys, and hearing not one but two sets of footsteps on the other side of the house. I opened the door and ran to the side driveway, where my car was. As soon as I got in, I saw that same figure come barreling around the house and running toward my car. I turned it on and fled for the main road, seeing his figure standing where my car just came from and watching me drive away. It took a little over 30 minutes for officers to arrive on my property. What they found was horrifying. Multiple windows were shattered, and the whole house looked like it had been destroyed on the inside. Doors and cabinets ripped from their hinges, furniture flipped over, and dents and tears in the walls. I told the police that I'd heard two people inside and saw one man outside, but the condition they left the house in, it was impossible to know how the two got in quietly while I was at home all day. I stayed in a hotel for weeks after that, getting the house repaired and putting it up for sale. I couldn't get over the feeling of knowing 3 people had been stalking me for who knows how long. And had I not escaped, I can't even imagine the horrible, disturbing things that would have happened that night. Even now, I have nightmares of me in that hallway, walking toward the room with the light off, knowing what was waiting for me just outside of view of the doorway. My name is Noah, and I'm 36. I'm gonna have to run you through a bit of backstory just to give context for why I live where I do. 2 years before this happened, me and my wife broke up just a few months after buying a house together. It wasn't a bad breakup, and we technically didn't divorce until months later, but I digress. The house we bought was massive, like way too big for even the both of us. But it was supposed to be something we could grow into and maybe have kids and dogs and whatever in the future. After we split ways, it was left for me to figure out whether to sell it for a loss or just continue living in it. I chose to stay. So I lived alone in that house for 2 whole years. I told myself I'd find a way to use the space. Like, since I worked from home, maybe I'd use a room for my office, and then have a workout room and a bedroom, all separate so that it wasn't all that empty. But I never really got around to it. The entire huge house was mostly left hollow and vacant. If you opened a random door, there's a good chance nothing would be behind it but a dusty, unused room. I wouldn't even go into half the rooms for months at a time. I didn't mind it too much, but occasionally I'd get that uneasy feeling of being alone in a giant empty house. That, mixed with just overall loneliness, I finally decided to do something I'd been wanting to do for years, and adopt a dog from a shelter. That's when all of this started. I found a small 8-month-old puppy named Piper. She was a beagle, and I picked her up after work from a shelter about 3 hours away from me. So by the time I'd gotten home, it was around 8 p.m. I let her roam around the yard for a bit, then showed her inside to let her explore her new home. In the shelter, Piper was very excited and happy and energetic, and even on the car ride home. But as soon as I let her inside, she became very timid. I thought she was just unfamiliar with the home, and all the change was making her anxious, so I didn't think too much into it. I left her alone to explore, and sat on the couch to give her space. She spent all but 2 minutes walking around, before jumping up on the couch with me, huddling up right on my lap. She almost seemed afraid of something. But again, I had every reason to believe it was all just normal behavior of a new pup moving into a new home. Later, I brought her upstairs and we went to bed. In the morning, everything seemed a little better. She followed me around while I made breakfast and coffee, then sat below my office desk while I worked for the day. However, a few hours in, she got up and walked toward the doorway, standing halfway in the hall, looking very alert. Then, after a few seconds, she fully left the room, and I could hear her nails clicking on the floor, walking down the hallway toward the staircase. I thought she finally felt comfortable enough to look around, so I left her alone and kept working. I want to say 10 minutes went by, when suddenly she started barking like crazy from somewhere downstairs. I jumped up from the desk and quickly hurried through the hallway and down the steps, still with her barks echoing all throughout the home, down every corridor, making it hard to even tell where she was. I called out her name and moved through all the rooms before finding her. Strangely, Piper was standing right in the middle of one of the empty rooms downstairs. Like she was just standing, looking at the wall and barking. Once she saw me, she hurried over and stood right next to me, tail down and looking nervously at the empty room. I walked in, and there was nothing to look at or make sense of. It was entirely empty. I tried to calm her down, picking her up and closing the door to the room. I brought her back upstairs to the office, and after a few minutes, I continued working. Rest of that day, not much happened. When I finished work, I took her for a walk around the area. Then we spent the night watching TV, going upstairs and getting in bed at 10. But in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not to a noise or anything. I guess just a feeling. I sat up and saw Piper standing right up to the bedroom door, her ears up and her gaze locked on the gap in the doorway. I called her name, but she didn't move. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure how or why, but I laid back down and fell asleep without a second thought. Can't even believe I managed to, now that I'm thinking back on it. I guess I really just thought she was uncomfortable being in a new place. But I woke up in the morning and things seemed to be okay. Piper was up on the bed with me and didn't act strange at all. I got dressed and headed downstairs, letting her outside and doing my typical morning routine. When she came back in, we both headed upstairs to my desk. Just like the day before, she laid down right under my desk while I worked. I made sure to check on her a few times, looking under the desk at her, and every time she was just sleeping, so I kept working. Think it wasn't until almost 6 o'clock, when I was just about done with work and the sun had mostly gone down, that I looked under my desk again, and she wasn't there. I looked around the room, and she was just gone. Must have slipped out without me noticing. I closed my laptop and got up, calling Piper's name as I walked into the hallway. But I didn't hear anything. Didn't hear her walking around or barking or anything at all. The house was dead silent. Piper? Piper, where you at? My voice echoed through the house. I felt something unnerving come over me as I started walking down the hall and down to the first floor. There were no signs of her. It was so quiet I could hear my own heart beating. I walked down the next hallway, leading to the room I found her in yesterday. As I got closer, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It was cracked open, which I was sure I hadn't left it like that. I pushed it further open. Piper was sitting in the far corner of the room, shivering and facing the doorway I was in. She looked terrified, like something else was in the house with us. It gave me a sense to turn around before approaching her, and when I checked behind me, I barely caught a glimpse of someone peering down the hallway back by the stairs. I quickly backed into the room and slammed the door, locking it and moving toward Piper. A few seconds later, quiet footsteps started coming down the hallway. He came right up to the other side of the door. Piper began quietly whimpering, still huddled in the corner, staring at the door. I was honestly too scared to even move. I just stood there, in the middle of the room, waiting for something to happen. The person behind the door didn't move either for a while, before they started quietly walking back down the hallway. It was almost terrifying how confident it felt they were, not running or anything. Felt like they weren't fazed by anything going on, or that this was exactly what they wanted, which made me wonder what it was exactly they were here for. I didn't hear anything after that. I think I stayed in that room with Piper for 30 minutes. I just couldn't get myself to move. When I eventually opened the door, I looked down the unlit hallway, and all the way at the end, I could see the front door was wide open. Hoping it meant whoever that was gone, I ran back upstairs to get my phone and call the cops. While I was up there, I noticed several open doors that, again, I had always kept closed. As soon as I got my phone, I ran back down to Piper and held up inside that room until police made it. They searched, not only inside, but also several acres around the house, but found nothing. No signs of the intruder still being around. However, they did find signs of him having been in my home. In one of the rooms upstairs, the one right next to my office, there were a bunch of random items suggesting that someone had been living there, maybe for months. And worse yet, it seemed like the person had likely been spending the days sleeping in the closet, so I wouldn't notice or hear them, and would then come out at night to leave and re-enter the home or to hang around inside the house. Of course, bringing Piper into my home, she could probably sense someone else was inside with us. Makes me think of when I woke up in the middle of the night finding Piper staring at the door. He could have been walking around right outside the bedroom. And as for the room she was barking at the wall or ceiling in, it was the room directly below the one the person was using as their hideout. She might have heard them move around up there or something. After it was all said and done, this event was enough to get me to finally sell the house and move into something smaller, bringing Piper with, of course. She's absolutely the best companion I ever could have asked for, and since moving, she's been just as happy and excited as she was when I found her at the shelter, and hasn't been anxious in the slightest. I still worry about the person not being found though, and would come back. I know it's unlikely, but I think I'll never really forget about it. Last November, I took a road trip out to my family's home for Thanksgiving. I lived around 20 hours away, which in road trip time is about 3 days of driving comfortably, and 2 days if really pushing it. This drive I'd done before, and hated it every time because of how incredibly boring most of it was. My parents lived on a small ranch that to me felt like the middle of nowhere, so a big portion of the drive was through nothing. Either just plain open fields or vast untouched forests. After hours and hours of the same scenery, it always got painfully boring. The first half of the drive from leaving my city was always alright though. It was on the typical highways that mostly everyone takes if they were headed to or from a major city. However, it was toward the end of my second day of driving that I merged off of that highway and onto, I guess you'd call a side road. It was still a highway, but only one lane, and way less people drove on it, not truckers or anything, and it really only led out to smaller, less distinguished towns. I made it to this part around 7 or 8 in the afternoon, so I wasn't planning to drive too much longer. I hoped there would be a town I could pull off in that had a motel or something. I drove another 2-ish hours. The road was completely dark and empty, just my headlights lighting up the way through the fog. I hadn't seen a single place to pull off and sleep at, so eventually when I found a small gas station, I figured it was better than nothing and pulled in. Now this gas station looked extremely old. It looked like it was just some sort of family-owned place in the middle of nothing. I didn't see a single light in the distance of any sort of town or even houses. However, the gas station's lights were on, and I was able to use the pump to top off my tank. Afterward, I parked in a spot on the side of the building and headed inside to ask if I could sleep for a few hours in their parking lot. When I walked in, a single guy was standing behind the counter, looked maybe 50, and was taken aback by me walking in. Guess customers don't usually stop by this late. I asked him if I could park for a couple hours. He mentioned right away that the station was closing in 15 minutes, and he would be leaving, but that if I was comfortable staying at the empty place overnight, then he didn't mind. I thanked him and bought a couple energy drinks for tomorrow, then headed back out to my car. But I replayed the conversation in my head, and I thought it was kind of weird the way he said, if I was comfortable. It sounded like he was saying I really shouldn't be, or that most people around here wouldn't be comfortable with it. I figured maybe he meant that most people just didn't sleep in their cars, and not that sleeping in my car here specifically is the problem. I got back in my car and laid the seat back, setting an alarm for 3 a.m., which was about 4 hours from then. After 15 minutes, I heard the guy lock up the gas station doors, and his car drive away. I looked around. Now, without the gas station lights on, it was pitch black, and extremely quiet. It was actually kind of eerie, being alone there. I closed my eyes again. Honestly, I'm unsure whether I fell asleep or not, because my eyes were closed and I was trying to for so long, at least an hour or so, when I suddenly heard the sound of tires pulling into the gravel outside of the gas station. They got closer and closer, until I eventually opened my eyes to see what was going on. I felt my heart get a little faster, seeing a dark pickup truck right beside my car. What the hell were they doing here? None of their headlights were on either. I couldn't see the driver, or really anything other than the truck outlined by the darkness around it. But it was facing me, so I felt like there was a chance whoever was in there could see me. I got really uncomfortable and didn't want to take any chances. I quickly put my seat back up, turned my car on, and drove out of there. I hoped it was nothing, but the way it all happened felt really strange. An empty, closed gas station in the middle of nowhere, and a truck decides to pull in with all its lights off and pull right up to my car. Couldn't really think of how that wasn't something bad. Getting out of there and back on the road made me feel a lot safer though. However, I barely got a quarter mile away from the gas station before I hit something in the middle of the gravel road. I only caught a glimpse of it in my headlights before my tire ran it over, and it sounded like a pretty bad hit. I quickly pulled off to the side and looked in my rear mirror, but couldn't get a good enough look, so I put the car in park and stepped out. Again, I noticed how quiet it was outside. Just the cold wind blowing around as I walked down the road and tried to see what it was that I hit. It looked like a large duffel bag, but like really large. And honestly, the reason I was so curious as to get out and look is because it kind of looked like a body bag. Maybe it was just my mind's tendency to always think the worst. But I didn't even get close enough to it before hearing the distant sound of tires pushing through the gravel down the road. I looked up and saw nothing but pitch black as the sound got closer and closer. I ran back to my car and got in. I glanced in my mirror as the sound got even louder before that truck suddenly appeared in my back headlights. Looked like they were going insanely fast, speeding right past the object in the road and suddenly slamming on their brakes and swerving behind my car, abruptly stopping. The front and side door both opened and two men jumped out, but by then I was already flooring it back down the road. I couldn't believe how much my hands were shaking as I tried to call 911. Each time, the call would connect for a couple of seconds, then the line would drop because I had no signal. Thankfully, I don't think the truck continued to follow me though, as I never saw them again. That stretch of road went on for maybe 45 minutes before I found a different road to get on that led to a more populated area. Calling the police at that point probably didn't help much, but I did anyway. Half hour later, I got a call back saying they found nothing at all in the area. The rest of the drive, and honestly the entire trip, I was genuinely horrified of what I might have stumbled across that night. I don't know what that truck was up to, or what I saw in the middle of the road, but thinking about what it all could have been still gives me chills. I never took that way ever again, and haven't heard of any information as to what might have happened that night. It was snowing on this Halloween. Me and my friend group were all planning to have a big night of trick-or-treating, but with the snow coming down pretty heavily, a lot of their parents wouldn't let them out for too long. To be fair, it usually wasn't this bad in October around here, but for the last week, our city was in the middle of an early snowstorm. Anyway, it ended up being just me and my friends John and Hayden. They were still able and willing to go trick-or-treating. We all put on some heavy snow gear, boots, jackets, hats, all that stuff. Pretty much the only parts of our costumes you could see were the masks we were wearing. We started trick-or-treating. For the first couple hours, there were a decent amount of kids running around doing the same as us. But once the sun got lower, it was basically just us three, walking around in the snow. We continued going door to door, eventually getting up to one of the houses on the corner of the block. There was nothing unusual about it. We went up, knocked on the door, and got candy from the older woman that lived there. But it was when we turned to leave the porch that we walked past a man on the driveway. He had a thick jacket on, and a really creepy mask. More creepy than the typical ones you see, as this one looked kind of realistic, even having long black hair attached to it, draping over his shoulders. Hayden said he recognized the mask as Momo, which if you were around on the internet about a decade ago, you've probably heard of it. It's unsettling to say the least, but definitely not something most younger kids would be comfortable with seeing, even on Halloween. We all noticed him and felt really weird about it. The man wasn't walking up or down the driveway. He was just standing there in the snow, watching us. We continued down the sidewalk, turning back a few times to look at him, but the blizzard quickly covered up our view of him. I think another thing that made us feel a little uneasy about it was that it was clearly a man, not a kid. He was tall and completely alone out there. So what was he doing? John convinced us to skip a few houses, just to be safe. I don't think any of us wanted to run into that guy again. We crossed over to the next street and got back to going door to door. Have to say, the whiteout from the snow keeping us from seeing anything more than a house or two down the road made things a lot more uncomfortable. We had no idea if the man was still out there. I think 30 minutes passed. The sun was fully down, and even the streetlights were barely beaming through the falling snow. It was around then that John said he had to go back home, since his parents told him to be back by sundown if it was still snowing. Hayden and I walked with him back to his house, then decided on what to do with just the two of us. I know it hadn't really been that long, but by this point, neither of us were thinking about that creepy man anymore. He hadn't actually done anything, and we never saw him following us, so we had no reason to keep thinking about it. Me and Hayden went to a few more doors and got some more candy, before we both were getting really cold and found ourselves just not enjoying it too much. So Hayden split ways and went back home, leaving me to head back to my house alone. It was about a 15-minute walk away, but in the snow, probably longer. Almost immediately, once it was just me out there, it hardly felt like Halloween. Snow covering every inch of the neighborhood, and nobody else walking around. Literally just me. Once I realized that, I started getting a little paranoid, looking all around and hoping to see another group of trick-or-treaters. But instead, I saw something else. On the other side of the street from the sidewalk I was on, there was a forest, and through the trees, someone was watching me. At first, I just saw his figure, standing far back, and mostly covered by the darkness and the falling snow. But as I continued walking and looking across the street, the figure moved with me, matching my pace and staying in view of me. I started to walk faster, eventually getting to a turn where I could go deeper into the neighborhood, where there were more houses and no forests. But the figure followed. He walked out of the tree line, and when he passed under a streetlight, I saw that same disturbing mask with the long black hair. He must have followed us the entire time, waiting for one of us to be alone. I hurried, moving as fast as I could. The empty and quiet streets made it feel like I was running for my life in an abandoned neighborhood. When I made it home, I locked the door behind me, but for some reason didn't tell my parents what was happening. I just went straight to my room. I guess I was scared to admit that I thought someone was actually following me, as if not admitting it would somehow make it not true. For a few minutes, I just sat on my bed and caught my breath, until the doorbell rang. I immediately felt a chill run through me, knowing that I saw no one else outside while I was running back home. I heard my parents talking, confused that any kids were still out trick-or-treating. My mom went and grabbed some of the candy that they'd already put away. Then she answered the door. As she did, I quietly walked around to the hallway and looked down at who was at the door. My stomach dropped. It was the tall man in the mask, and although I couldn't see his eyes, I know he saw me at the back of the hallway. He didn't even take any candy or say anything to my mom. He just walked away. Likely, the man was hoping I would be alone. My mom found it really creepy and strange, knowing as well that it was an adult, but she assumed it was just a dumb Halloween prank. I never told her what really happened, or what that man was really trying to do that night. Where I live, around Halloween, it always gets pretty cold. Sometimes it snows, sometimes it doesn't. But regardless, that's just how it's always been. This year, on Halloween, it had snowed pretty heavily overnight, and by the time trick-or-treat hours had started, it began snowing again. There weren't too many crowds out because of it. I was just chilling inside at home, handing out candy whenever someone did come by, and watching TV by the fireplace to pass the time. All the kids that came by had heavy jackets or coats covering their whole costumes, so the whole Halloween spirit wasn't really hitting too hard this year. As the night went on, the snow started coming down even harder, which sent pretty much all the kids home that were already stubborn enough to still go out in the cold before. 30 minutes went by, with no kids coming to the door. It was around 7 o'clock, and the sun had already set, so I assumed that the trick-or-treating was done for the night. I got up from the living room and started walking over to the door, but immediately was taken aback. The front door was open, swaying in the cold wind that was blowing into the house. I walked over and looked out, not seeing anyone, then closed it. I stood there and thought about it for a second, figuring I probably just didn't fully close it earlier, whenever the last kids came by, and the wind must have pushed it further open. I mean, I knew I didn't lock it, because it was Halloween, and I was constantly opening it anyway. I let it off as nothing to worry about, and went back to the couch. I did open up the curtains by the window, on my way back, just to watch the snow fall. Another few hours went by, as the night got colder and the snow came down even harsher. I had to check the weather a few times to make sure there wasn't some kind of massive blizzard hitting our town. I think it was around 10 that I started to feel tired enough to go to bed, so I turned everything off and went to the kitchen to finish doing some dishes from dinner that I hadn't cleaned up yet. It was just something I did as part of my nightly routine, cleaning up the place before going to sleep. As I was down there putting things away though, I heard what sounded like a creaking noise above me. I literally stopped what I was doing and stared at the blank ceiling, listening to the sound until it quietly faded out. I was kind of in awe for a moment. It sounded just like a door opening, which ironically in the moment I thought sounded way too much like a horror movie to actually be what it was. I finished up downstairs, turned all the lights off, then headed upstairs to go to bed, and check on whatever that sound was that I heard. Honestly, I didn't expect to find anything at all, and didn't really care that much. But when I got to my bedroom, I immediately noticed the closet was open. This changed everything for me, instantly making me unsettled. I put everything together, between the front door being randomly found open, and then this door also suddenly opening. This couldn't be a coincidence. For good measure, I looked into the closet and didn't see anything. I kinda was hoping there would be something obvious to tell me that something was definitely off. I even checked around the room. I just couldn't see how if someone had snuck inside, why weren't there any other signs of them? Like, where the hell were they? And what was the point of sneaking in, if just to open a few doors? I was still feeling really uneasy, so I shut the bedroom door and locked it, while I paced the room and thought about everything. And at some point, when I happened to be facing the door, I saw something. A shadow right under the door. It only took a few seconds to be almost sure that someone was standing right behind it. I tried not to move or make any sounds, even though, looking back, whoever was behind that door obviously knew I was already in there. I guess I just didn't want them to know that I knew. I must have stood there frozen, staring at the shadow under the door for an entire 2 or 3 minutes. I wanted to call the police, but didn't want them to hear me, which left me just unsure what to do. I think it was actually because I didn't move or make any noise for so long though, that whoever was behind there must have realized something was wrong and that I was probably onto them. because the doorknob slowly turned a few times, clicking against the lock. Then the shadow moved away from the door. Maybe they recognized I could see the shadow under the door. I don't know. But after that, I waited for probably 10 minutes straight. I didn't hear anything else or see anything. I had no idea if the person was even still behind the door, let alone in my house. Eventually, I had to call the police, but still tried to be quiet. It seemed like the intruder had left though, because cops walked in and didn't find anyone else in the house. The whole thing is really just a terrifying mess. I can't even imagine what would have happened if I didn't close and lock the door when I did. Even a few minutes later would have changed everything about that night. Obviously, because I never saw the intruder, I had no info to give the police aside from some possible suspects, like crazy exes or whatever, which I didn't really have. There's no saying who it was or what they were going to do. I'm 32 and live in a small home on the countryside. This night was pretty much going normally, up until just before bed. I had this day off and was home all day. I didn't notice anything unusual. Around 9 p.m., I went up to my bedroom and got ready for bed. I was on my phone watching YouTube while trying to fall asleep, when I started to hear something. I paused the video. Faintly, I could hear someone talking outside. At least 2 people, maybe more though. The way they were talking was like they were trying to be quiet, which made it all the more suspicious. And this was actually the first time I've ever had anyone trespass, at least that I know of. I mean, I lived pretty far from other houses, and there were no sidewalks or anything near my house, so anyone walking around this close had to know what they were doing. I sat up in bed and tried to listen to what the guys were saying, but it was still too faint, so I got up and went over to the window. As soon as I stepped up to it, all the voices suddenly stopped talking. A chill ran through my body, knowing this had to mean that whoever was out there could see me. But all I saw was darkness covering the entirety of my property. The thought of all their eyes staring up at me in the window was really unsettling. I quickly backed away. I really hoped this was all just an accident, like they somehow didn't know they happened to walk onto my property. But if that was the case, why didn't they leave when they saw my house? Why did it sound like the voices were walking up closer to the house? I waited a few minutes, then walked up to the window again. But again, I didn't see anything. I then went downstairs and up to basically every window, trying to see anything at all. It was the fear of not knowing what was going on, or where they were, that made it so unsettling. I think it was probably 30 minutes after initially hearing the men outside that I decided to risk opening the front door to get a better look and listen. I turned on the light, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. After a few seconds, I stepped a bit further from the door. I didn't hear anything but the wind and the soft sound of crickets in the distance. And past the light, it was way too dark to make out any shapes of trees or anything. But as I stood out there, an overwhelming feeling came over me. My eyes started shifting all around, and I became very paranoid. It was like I could sense multiple eyes looking at me from somewhere. I quickly hurried back inside and locked the door. Probably just a gut feeling, but it felt like something was about to happen. I don't know what, but I didn't want to find out. Once I was inside and with all the doors locked, the feeling faded away, which made me think it really was just a feeling. I grabbed a glass of water and went back upstairs, letting myself calm down and relax before getting back in bed and trying to fall asleep. Took a while, but I did manage to. Had to have been asleep for a few hours, but I was woken up violently by a crashing sound from the hallway just outside my bedroom. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, sprinting up to the door and opening it. I looked into the hallway. There was shattered glass spread all over the floor. Someone had thrown a rock straight through the window that was on the back hallway wall. I genuinely couldn't believe it and stood in shock for several seconds as I processed what this meant. Then I heard the voices again, multiple, all yelling commands at each other, and in between their shouting were heavy slams against the front door. The weight of it shook the whole house. Among the heavy slams, more windows were getting shattered as I went back into the bedroom and locked myself in. I dialed 911. It was while I was still on the call that I heard the terrifying sound of the door crashing open and multiple people running into the house. Their footsteps ran through the bottom floor. I could even hear some of them laughing. The operator on the line said an officer was 5 minutes away, but knowing the group had already broken inside and could probably easily take down the bedroom door, I didn't feel safe waiting. I went up to the window and opened it. Because this place was a ranch home with sloped ceilings, this window gave access to the roof. Obviously, you weren't supposed to get onto the roof from there, as it was incredibly dangerous, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. I crawled out and onto the roof, then closed the window and moved further up to the top. A minute later, the men started banging on the bedroom door. A couple of them yelled to open up, some even using a jokingly friendly voice. It was sickening. Then, it only took a few hits before they bashed it open. Their footsteps scattered around below me. After looking for 30 seconds, I could hear them getting frustrated. They moved through the entire upper floor, probably double-checking every room. After that, I really don't know what was going on. They remained inside the house, though, until police sirens were coming up in the distance. Then the group ran back out of the house and straight into the darkness. I stayed on the roof until officers were inside and able to help me down. I still can't believe I got away from that. A whole group aggressively breaking into my home on the countryside in the middle of the night while I was alone. I can only imagine what they were trying to do. My home was basically trashed, but nothing was really missing, which unfortunately means they definitely were looking for me. I don't know if it was me specifically, or they just happened to choose my house just because, but I don't think I'll ever know. I used to work the night shift at a small shipping warehouse right outside of town. It wasn't a big place, just a long concrete building with 3 loading docks, a tiny office, and endless rows of metal shelving. Most nights, it was only me and 1 or 2 other guys, but the company cut hours during the slow season, so for a few weeks I was completely alone from midnight to 6 a.m. I didn't think much of it at first. I guess the peace and quiet was nice, and the job was easy enough. I kept my earbuds in most of the night and tried to not think about how quiet it was. Heavy machines that ran all day were silent at night, so even the smallest noise echoed. This night in particular was very quiet. No cars driving on the highway outside or even wind hitting the building. From inside, I could hear the soft sound of crickets in the forest that was just beside the building, because there was nothing to drown out the noise. At some point early in my shift, I put my earbuds in and worked for a good while without stopping. I was in the far back corner, scanning a pallet, when I heard something that made me stop. Footsteps. Light ones. Not hurried or heavy, but almost definitely footsteps. They came from the front of the warehouse, near the office. At first, I thought my boss might have stopped by without texting me, which has happened before, and gave me as good of a scare as you'd imagine. I took my earbuds out and listened again, but now there was nothing. After a minute, I told myself I imagined it, but then just as I started getting back to work, I heard them again. Just a few footsteps, slow and spaced out, like whoever it was wasn't sure where they were going.
John? That you?
I called out my boss's name, but he didn't call back, and the footsteps seemed to stop too. I walked toward the front, trying to act like I wasn't nervous. The warehouse lights didn't reach the office area that well, leaving that part of the building dim and shadowy. I flipped on the office light and checked inside. I even checked the break room and found nothing. Didn't know what else to do other than shake it off and get back to work. Usually I didn't get worked up about stuff like this, so I knew either tonight I was just feeling off or something was actually off about the warehouse. Another hour went by, and I'd finished scanning what I needed to, and headed back to the office to log everything and check on a couple of things. Like I said before, the office was kind of in the back corner of the building. I sat down and started doing all the boring computer work of just clicking through things and adjusting the numbers from the scans. I was in there no more than 5 minutes, when for some reason I looked up at the hallway window, the one that overlooked the warehouse floor. Someone was walking between the shelving rows. Just a silhouette, barely visible, but I felt like even from the quick half look I saw, the movement was clearly someone walking. I stood up so fast the chair tipped over, and I shouted hey at them to try to get them to stop. My voice resonated down the warehouse, but after they disappeared out of view behind the shelf, I didn't see anything. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find to defend myself, some old metal tool from the desk, and stepped outside the office. I started slowly walking down, and I kept calling out something along the lines of "Who's here?" and "You can't be in here," over and over. No matter how hard I tried to fake it, my voice didn't sound confident at all. I moved aisle by aisle, checking corners and even looking behind boxes where a grown adult couldn't possibly be hiding, and yet I still found no one. Eventually, I made it to the far back wall, and every row behind me was empty. I sort of stared at the warehouse with this blank stare, trying to understand this. The only other place I could look were the couple side hallways that I guess if it really was a person I saw, they could have snuck into, but I felt like I would have heard the heavy metal doors opening and closing. But there was no way I'd be able to get back to work without checking. I opened one of the doors and looked down. This area I hadn't really been to. I think it led to all the managers' offices and stuff like that I had no business ever being in. I didn't see anyone though, so I turned around and let the door start closing behind me. And just when I did, I heard the sound of a door opening from down the corridor. I quickly spun around and grabbed the door before it shut, looking down the hall again. There was a man now, standing right at the end of the corridor. He looked early 20s, but not like the normal young guy you usually see. He looked disheveled and crazy, eyes wide open enough for me to see them from all the way down at the other end of the hall. I don't know if he was on something or what, but it was horrifying and disturbing the way he looked at me. I called out, asking what he was here for, and telling him he needed to go. The guy didn't even look like he comprehended what I said. I called out again, trying to sound more aggressive, and mentioning that I'd called security, which was a lie, but I hoped it would work. He started taking a few steps forward. I couldn't tell if he was complying with me or just trying to close the distance, so I just stood in the doorway, trying to talk to him still. Think it was when he was about 15 to 20 feet away that I noticed something in his hand, and by the time I looked back up at his eyes, he lifted his arm and hurled it at me. Chucked it with all of his strength, sending it flying right at my head, only missing me by a couple of inches and hitting the door frame beside me. It was a hammer, or large metal wrench. The harsh metal echo it made when it hit the door frame felt like it burst my eardrums. I immediately turned and booked it out of there, hearing the guy chase me like his life depended on it. I looked over my shoulder a couple times, seeing him still just 10 to 15 feet behind me, with that horrifying look in his eyes. I made it to the office and locked myself in, hearing him slam his body into the metal door and try opening it. Luckily, this office was solid, only having that metal door and the window, which was the super sturdy kind. Like maybe 4 inches thick of heavy-duty glass that isn't supposed to shatter in a rough work environment. The guy moved around to the window and started ravagely slamming his shoulder into it and punching it. He looked absolutely insane, but he eventually realized he couldn't break in and turned around and just walked away, slowly making his way down to the other end of the building and I'm assuming out the back door. I was already using the office phone to contact the police by this point, but it took forever for them to get to the warehouse, so the guy really could have been anywhere by this point. This wasn't some fancy new warehouse either, so the cameras were awful. It showed us the guy breaking into one of the doors and walking around, almost stalking me during my whole shift, but there were no clear views of his face to identify him with. Wasn't any way to know why he broke in or was trying to attack me either. I stayed at that job for a while afterward, and the event almost started to not even feel real because of how crazy it was. Eventually though, I did leave and get a similar gig somewhere else, figuring it wasn't worth hanging around with the chance the guy could come back looking for me. I was 18, still living with my parents, but because I was old enough, they could leave me home alone without it being a problem. This was one of the times where my parents were gone for I think a couple of days. Our home wasn't anything special, really just a typical neighborhood home in the suburbs. And as far as these sort of days go, I usually just sat around the house and watched TV or played video games. I didn't have my own car, so unless I felt like walking 30 minutes for some fast food, I had no reason to leave the house. In the morning, I pretty much just stayed in bed for a few hours watching TV, then finally got up to start my day, heading downstairs to the kitchen. Almost as soon as I got downstairs and started making breakfast, my friend sent me a text. I assumed he was just waiting for me to get online, so I finished making breakfast before even checking it. But when I did finally open it, I was a little confused. He said, "Who's the guy outside your house?" I genuinely was caught off guard by that. I responded, "What?" and went to the front window to look, but nobody was out there. No cars, no people, just an empty, quiet neighborhood. My friend's house was directly across from mine, and I didn't see him in the window or anything, so I was confused. After a minute, I decided to just call him, figuring it was some stupid joke he was trying to pull. He was the kind of friend to say stupid stuff like this sometimes, to mess with me, but this time I really didn't see where the joke in it was. He answered, and didn't even try to play it as a joke. He was serious, saying he actually saw some guy outside my house that he'd never seen before, and the only reason he even mentioned it was because the guy seemed like he was trying to look into the windows. That was super weird, but neither of us could figure out who it was or what he was doing, and with him not there anymore, we kind of just moved on from it and hopped on a Discord call to play video games for a few hours. I only went downstairs once during that time to refill my water, and I did a quick look out the window again, not seeing anyone. We were online until probably 5 or 6 before getting off the call. All I remember was that it was already dark outside, and I realized how much time had passed. I got up and went downstairs. I started making a quick dinner, unsure how I'd spend the rest of my night. Probably just watch TV in my room. But while I was in the kitchen cooking, I saw a shadow move or flicker on the wall in front of me. I immediately turned around. I saw nothing, no movement or anything in the living room that could have moved, until I saw the window. I walked up to it and looked out. It was dark and still. I didn't see anyone. The image of someone possibly staring at me from outside gave me chills though, but I thought I was probably just on edge. I mean, the shadow I saw could have been a car passing by or something. I was sure it was nothing to worry about. I finished making dinner and went upstairs to my room to eat, then laid in bed and watched TV. I was up there for at least an hour, maybe a little more, just zoning out and half watching whatever was on. At some point, as it got later and darker in my room, I realized I hadn't turned on any of the lights upstairs. It was just the TV lighting up my room, and I kept finding my eyes shifting and looking at the crack under the bedroom door, seeing it was completely dark in the hallway outside my room. Usually that would never bother me, but this night it just felt off. Eventually I paused the show and decided to get up and grab a snack from downstairs, though it was more of an excuse to go around and turn all the lights on as well, and hopefully shake whatever feeling I had. As soon as I opened my bedroom door though, the feeling grew worse. It felt like the house was too quiet, and the hallway was eerily dark. I flicked on the light, seeing it was just an empty hallway, and feeling silly or almost annoyed with myself for being creeped out. I headed downstairs. Before getting a snack, I checked out the windows. This paranoia I was feeling wasn't something I think I'd ever felt before, at least not to this degree. I even left all the lights on downstairs, knowing that I wasn't planning on coming back down before bed, just so I didn't have to think about it being pitch black down there. I started going back upstairs, but on my way up the steps, I paused. I thought I'd heard what sort of sounded like my footsteps resonating through the house, but it didn't quite sound right, and I'd never heard the house echo sounds like that before. I took a few steps down and then back up, and it didn't make the same sound. I stood there unsure for a moment, replaying what I'd heard over and over in my head. I felt my eyes get wider and my heart begin racing before I bolted up the stairs and into my room, locking the door shut and calling the police. I was 99% sure that what I'd heard was someone else's footsteps in the house matching mine, almost like they were mimicking me walking so that I wouldn't hear them coming up behind me. When I was standing on the stairs thinking about it, I realized that was exactly what it sounded like. After the police were on the way, I called my friend, asking if he saw anything. He said no, but went to the front window while we were on call, trying to look around. It was a couple minutes later, he suddenly said,
"Oh shit,"
and saw some guy leaving out of the window on the side of my house and running into the trees. He said it looked like the same guy he saw before. I couldn't even speak for a minute, terrified of how right I was about my paranoid feeling of not being alone. When police made it, I stood outside with them while they did their whole investigation. My friend also came out and talked to them. It didn't lead to much though, aside from the promise to search for the man and follow up if there's any leads. They did, however, compare it to a similar incident from a couple weeks ago in a nearby neighborhood, where a kid was also home alone and some guy was creeping around outside, eventually coming up to the window and trying to convince the kid to let him in. In both cases though, it isn't really clear what he was plotting. Kidnapping is the obvious answer, but he didn't seem to have a car, so dragging a kid kicking and screaming out of a house didn't seem likely to me. I don't know what was going to happen that night, and I never found out. because the guy is still out there, probably still creeping around and stalking someone without them knowing it. I was on a road trip across the states to meet up with my family and a couple of friends on the West Coast. On the way there, I booked a cabin to stay at just for the night. Plan was to only be there for 10 to 12 hours. Basically just eat dinner, shower, and sleep. Then head back onto the road first thing in the morning. When I arrived, I'd been on the road for 9 hours already and was very tired. The cabin was a lot more isolated than I thought, though. It could have just looked that way because it was in the middle of the night and in the woods, but it definitely wasn't what I expected. I think I was expecting it to be part of a whole row or cluster of other cabins that people also rented out, but it wasn't. It just sat alone. I parked in the gravel in front of the cabin and headed inside. Oddly, the front door didn't match the rest of the cabin. It wasn't an issue by any means, but it was just very noticeable, and I thought it was a weird decision. It was a modern, heavy door, while the rest of the cabin was all wooden and old. Anyway, this cabin was just a single room, with a bed, kitchenette, couch, and TV all crammed into the small space. It had a very old-timey feel. I wasted no time getting dinner ready, eating, and then getting ready for bed. I was pretty tired, so I passed out really fast. But I think only an hour or so after I'd fallen asleep, I woke up. Not to a noise, but a feeling. I know it sounds crazy, but when I woke up, I just felt really uneasy for some reason. I sat up and just listened for a moment to make sure it wasn't anything I heard, but the cabin was silent. Still unsure, I peeked out the window next to me. I didn't expect to see anything, but when I looked out, I could immediately see something moving in the woods. It took me a few seconds to really tell what it was, but by the way the figure moved, I was pretty sure it was a person. What the hell were they doing out here? I'm not exaggerating when I say it was pitch black outside. The forest was dense, and no light from the moon or stars was coming down. I could only watch them for 30 seconds before they were completely out of view. I stayed by the window for a bit, waiting to see if they appeared again, but after 5 minutes, I laid back down. Tomorrow was going to be a long day of driving. I tried to close my eyes and drift back into sleep, but I was probably laying there for 40 minutes, still eyes closed and not being able to sleep, before I heard something outside the cabin. There wasn't enough time to even comprehend what it was before a knock came at the door. Again, this whole cabin was one room, so the door they were knocking on was literally just a couple feet from me, and there was nowhere else to hide or exit from. I jumped up from the bed. My head was spinning. I don't think I'd been that scared in my entire life. Then, a man's voice yelled from the other side of the door, "Hey, open up. Open the door now. I know you're in there. Open the fucking door." His voice was aggressive and angry, and only had me even more horrified. I didn't know whether to respond or what to do. They clearly knew I was inside. I mean, even my car was out front, practically giving it away. I got my phone and dialed 911. It took a minute for the call to go through. I think my phone had no service, so it was trying to use data, and it was just struggling. But when it got through, I got online with an operator who said an officer was on the way. The guy outside the cabin was still hitting the door. Honestly, I couldn't tell if he was just banging on the door or actively trying to break the door down. He never got in, though. After a minute or two, I heard him leave the porch. Then I heard glass shattering, which I knew was from my car. When cops pulled up, he wasn't there. There were some clear indicators that he ran back into the woods, but obviously they weren't just going to run in there and look for him, at least not in the middle of the night. But when the owner of the cabin was contacted, things got a little weird. He admitted that a previous resident had a similar incident, but they never contacted the police about it. Apparently, someone came knocking on the door in the middle of the night and was yelling at them. The next morning, after the one staying there had left, the owner found the door bashed open, like broken into with a sledgehammer or something. I guess the owner thought if he reported it, word would get out and nobody would want to stay there, so he kept it on the low and just replaced the door with something heavier and more sturdy. Really weird. I don't know how to feel about that. End of the day though, I was just glad to get out of there and go see my family and friends. Maybe I could have done more about it, but I just wanted it to be over with. What that man came to the cabin to do will be something I continue to think about likely for the rest of my life. I worked at a gas station from 2018 through 2020. Not the best job I've had, but it worked for the time being. As far as my shifts, I always tried to get my manager to schedule me for the overnights. I knew it'd be less work and I'd be alone. The first year, I did mostly regular shifts though, but on my second year, he finally started giving me overnights. I will say, although I was right about it being less work and nice to be alone, I didn't take into account just how boring it'd get. The business really slowed down past 10 p.m. Like, nearly nobody came through, and if they did, it was just to get gas outside, so I'm not kidding when I say I didn't have to do anything. I found myself doing whatever possible just to pass the time. Sometimes I'd even go outside and walk around the parking lot, completely out of boredom. Anyway, this night I assumed was gonna be like every other. By 12 a.m., I was looking for something to keep my mind busy. I thought emptying the trash by the gas pumps would be a good distraction, at least for a few minutes. I grabbed some trash bags and headed out there, emptying a couple of garbage cans and heading around to the back of the building to toss them in the dumpster. When I tossed them in, I nearly had a heart attack. There was a guy standing right behind it. I didn't notice him when I was walking up.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see you there.
I said nervously, mostly just embarrassed that I got jump scared and not yet fully processing it. The man didn't respond and just kind of stared at me with this weird, emotionless gaze. As I walked back to the front, I realized how weird it actually was that he was behind the building near the dumpsters. He didn't look homeless or anything, so what could he possibly be doing back there? I looked back a few times as I emptied the other garbage cans, then a little more cautiously went back to throw them out. But the man was gone, didn't see him anywhere. I tossed out the rest of the trash and went back inside. Maybe it was irresponsible of me, but I really didn't think it was all that concerning. There were other shops around the block, open late, and even a nearby bar that sometimes people walk to and from and pass by the gas station. I thought that's probably where he came from, and I just saw him at a weird timing while he was taking a shortcut behind the building. Or maybe he was just a drunk being a drunk. I pulled my phone out and checked the time. 12:15. I leaned on the counter and tried to think of something else to do, but my train of thought was interrupted when I saw something in the corner of my eye. I looked over toward the doorway that went into the back room. I swear I saw something move. I didn't immediately get scared because I very quickly assumed it was just me being tired and seeing things, but with nothing to do, I thought I might as well check on it. I began walking over, sort of leaning my head to the right to look around the corner of the doorway as I approached. The lights were off in that room, but right when I got into the doorway, I saw someone standing really close to the wall, like they were hiding and waiting for me to come in. As soon as I saw them and stopped, they came around the corner, It was that same man from behind the building, but he had the most disturbing expression on his face that I have yet to even get the image out of my head. It was a mix of rage and insanity. I barely had the chance to see the knife in his hand before he swung it toward me. My reactions took over and I jumped backward, hitting one of the shelves behind me before booking it out of the store. I ran pretty far away, then called 911. As I was standing out on the street, I couldn't really see whether the guy left the store or not, as it was pretty foggy out that night. Of course, though, the man was gone when cops arrived. My best guess is that he was actually a crazy homeless man, despite his looks, and probably hoping to end me and take whatever he needed from the store. He also could have just been absolutely insane and had an urge to do something horrible that night without ever being provoked. Who really knows? I quit a while after that and never heard anything about it since. I was chilling at home this night, just like any other. There really wasn't anything interesting going on. I was just enjoying my time sitting on the couch and watching TV, staying up late to take advantage of the long weekend. I guess I should mention I lived alone in a typical suburban home. I had a pretty nasty breakup a few months prior, and after it was all said and done, I decided to keep the house rather than sell it. But that's a story for another day. It was around 10 or 11 p.m., and I was sipping on a nice cold can of Budweiser when a sound came from out of nowhere. It sounded like a knock, but not from the front door, which still wouldn't have made sense at this time of night, but it was from behind me, like in the back of the house. I left the TV running and walked around to see what it was. To me, it sounded like something tapping on a window, but that had to not be right, so I assumed it was maybe something falling over. I walked through the hall and peeked my head into the family room, and then the kitchen, but there was nothing to see anywhere, so I just went back to the couch. I might be a little less cautious than the average person, because I really thought nothing of it. Like, I didn't care whatever it was, because it had to be nothing important. I stayed on the couch for a while, still just drinking and chilling, before I heard it again. Tapping on a window. After hearing it that second time, I was almost certain that that's what it was. I got up and went around to the other rooms again. This time, though, something was immediately off. One of the windows in the back of the room was open, and so was the basement door. If it were one or the other, I probably could have thought my way out of believing someone broke in, but both suddenly being open, and with the sounds I'd been hearing, I knew it was too much to be nothing. Now, I know how stupid of a decision it was, but at the time, I felt like I had to check the basement. I think the alcohol gave me some poor judgment, and to be honest, I was a pretty big guy with a big ego, so I wasn't about to run out of my house and let someone else get away scot-free. I looked down the dark and empty staircase for a moment. Somehow, there wasn't any sound coming from down there. I took a few steps down the creaky stairs and flipped on the dim lighting. Since moving in, I don't think I'd ever gone into the basement at night. I just never had a reason to. It was unfinished and kinda useless, so when I got to the bottom, I was caught off guard by just how little I could see. The lights barely did anything. There were dark corners all over that anyone could be hiding in, and that's when the fear really started kicking in. I sobered up real fast, and I got the hell out of that basement. I closed the door behind me and moved the nearest large piece of furniture to block it. I called the police, and by some odd chance, an officer happened to be just on the other side of the neighborhood, He got there quick, coming in with a flashlight and his gun drawn as he searched the basement. Didn't take him but 10 seconds to find a man crouched down in the dark corner right next to the stairs. I must have been just 3 or 4 feet away from him when I was down there. The man was armed, too, with a large kitchen knife. Thankfully, he didn't fight the cop, though, and went down easy. As far as why he broke in, it beats me. The man said he was just trying to shelter from the elements, which made no sense because it was pretty decent weather outside, and from what they could find, the man wasn't even homeless. He had an apartment downtown and a regular job. That was probably the closest I'd been to having my life cut short, and it's really disturbing how completely out of nowhere it would have happened, and for no known reason. Guess this is a lesson to never let your guard down too far, even on a seemingly uneventful night. This had to be only 5 or 6 weeks ago. It was spring and raining quite a bit, so I spent a lot of my time at home, inside and away from the rain. I had some papers to get done for work, so this night I was hanging out at my desk in the living room, working on my laptop. I was really tired, and even with coffee next to me, it didn't keep my eyes from feeling heavy. Every couple of minutes, I'd lean back in my chair, stretch, and rub my eyes to refresh myself before getting back to work. However, one of the times that I leaned back, I saw something next to me. I nearly jolted out of my chair. There was a face outside the window, directly across the room. Even more creepy, the guy was staring at me and didn't even flinch when I saw him. He was just standing there, face pressed into the window, smiling at me. I stood up and stared back at him, still in shock of seeing him there. Before I even said anything, they moved away from the window. I wasn't exactly a professional in being stared at through a window, so I didn't know what to do about it. I'd never even seen the guy before in my entire life. Eventually, I walked up and looked out, but whoever that was gone. I could see their footprints in the mud, going through my yard and into the trees. I backed up and kind of just stood in the middle of the room for a moment to collect myself. I thought maybe if I just made sure they were gone, then I'd be able to continue my night without freaking out too much. I quickly threw on my rain jacket and opened the front door, turning on the outdoor lights and stepping outside. It wasn't raining too bad, so I could see decently well. I walked over to the window he was standing under. It was kind of weird seeing the inside of my house from there. I could see my desk I was sitting at and the whole room perfectly lit up. It was just a little unsettling seeing it from that perspective, knowing someone was just staring at me from here. It gave me chills. I looked back down at the footprints in the mud and decided to follow them for a little bit. Replaying all of this now, I know this was dumb. I don't know what I was thinking. I followed the prints just up to where the trees started getting denser before I noticed something. They were facing toward my house. This was where they came from, which meant there wasn't any signs of them leaving. My heart rate picked up as I was figuring this all out. I turned around, now getting really scared and wanting to run back inside. But when I faced the window again, a person was now standing inside my home, looking out at me. I didn't skip a beat, running down to the road and banging on my neighbor's door. They woke up and let me in, calling the police for me. No one was there when they got there, but they found the back door was forced open, which likely happened just as I went outside to look for them. Had I stayed inside and been face to face with that sick man, I don't even know what he would have done. In 2016, I made a trip down to my father's old cabin. It was 6 hours away in the woods outside of the hometown he grew up in, which was no longer even a town. Just an abandoned row of old buildings and stores along a deserted road. We'd never really go to his cabin because he said there wasn't much of a reason to once the town was gone. But after he passed away, I figured it'd be nice to take a trip down there to visit the home he once built. I knew it'd be in real bad shape, and I wanted to do some restorations on it as best I could, just to keep it standing and preserve it for as long as possible. If anything, I hope the trip would clear my mind a little and give me some peace and quiet. I drove there, arriving at the town and parking my car behind one of the abandoned gas station buildings, then walked on the thin, rugged, winding trail 2 miles up to the cabin. I had all my backpacking gear, and brought along the tools I'd need for the job. There was a part of me that knew it might have toppled already, so I was prepared to camp the night in a tent if I had to. Luckily, after making the long trek through the woods though, I found the cabin still standing. It was in a small clearing in the trees, just a basic rectangular log cabin with vines and greenery growing up the outer walls. When I walked in, I noticed there were no locks on the door, and found the interior to be in pretty awful shape. Trash scattered everywhere, and a musty, unpleasant smell filling the room. It was clear that at some point, someone realized this place wasn't in use, and probably had stayed here, maybe for a while, although it seemed it wasn't recent. No signs of anything being there for a couple years or so. I moved what I could into the corner of the room, making a flat space to put my stuff, and with the sun already setting, I unrolled my sleeping bag and just settled in. I should mention, although I didn't hear or see anything that night, I couldn't sleep for any longer than 30 minutes at a time before waking up with a strange, disturbing feeling. It made for a really bad night. I got up at sunrise, groggy and wondering if this whole trip was a mistake. I used my little camping stove to brew up a coffee, then took a walk through the woods to clear my head. It was still kind of dark, the sun only barely peeking out through the trees. A little ways in, I found an overlook, sort of a hill where I could see above the tree line. Thought it'd be a great place to watch the sunrise, but I found something else. I could see the abandoned town from up there. It was very far away, but there was a light. Looked like it was from a window in one of the buildings. I couldn't tell from that distance if it was from a house or a store, and it turned off suddenly a minute later. It made me worry a bit about my car, but mostly I was just surprised anyone else was around here. Likely, it was just some urban explorers checking out the town, and nothing to worry about, although it was a really big coincidence. I sat on the hill for an hour watching the sun come up, then walked back through the woods to start working on the cabin. First thing was to reseal and clean up the outside. I will say though, the whole time I was out there working, I kept getting that feeling, the one I had during the night. Every time I looked back at the woods, this eerie sense loomed over me. It took me a bit to really understand what it was that I felt, but eventually I managed to grasp what I think it was. I felt like I wasn't alone. I kept working, but constantly looked over my shoulder. The possibility of anyone else being out here was genuinely impossible. The abandoned town, sure, but here, some random woods with nothing but a decaying cabin. I thought I must have been on edge for reasons that were beyond me. Once the sun was going down, I headed inside, testing out the old wood stove. These things seemed to be undying, as it fired up no problem and warmed up the cabin. I sat near it and just watched the flames, listening to it crackle as I thought about everything. My dad, this trip, just life in general. But sometime later in the night, the crackles in the flame were suddenly accompanied by a similar sound. cracks and crunching coming from the front of the cabin. I turned my head and listened. I only managed to realize it wasn't a wild animal and was definitely a person just as they got up to the front door. The wood stove suddenly felt like it was 1,000 times louder, preventing me from intently listening to whoever the hell was outside the cabin. Then they knocked and called out a name that made my whole world stop for a moment. The man called out my dad's name. It felt like it just took hold of me, making me stand up and walk up to the other side of the door in complete shock. How did he know my dad? I couldn't resist calling out and asking who he was. The man outside hesitated. I think he knew after I spoke that I wasn't my dad.
I'm an old friend of the man who built this cabin. Was hoping I'd get to see him again.
The unknown man spoke. I got a little closer to the door, the urge to open it and have someone to talk to about my dad, to hear stories and everything. But still, something kept me from opening it. Why was he even here? I asked, and the man said he lived in that old town. After thinking for a second, I decided to share that I was the son of the man he was looking for, my dad, and he had passed away. The man behind the door paused.
I'm real sorry to hear that, kid. Wish I could have seen him one more time.
Initially, it felt nice to hear that, but I quickly sensed something was off about the way he said it. Something in his voice. It wasn't the sadness I was expecting from someone who just found out they lost a friend. Before I could say anything, and almost like he knew I was thinking too hard about it, the man continued talking.
Why don't you open up and we can have a chat? It's real cold out here, son. Would be nice to share that fire.
Although he talked very slowly, I sensed an urgency or a lack of patience in his voice. Something in me felt he wasn't being truthful, that maybe he wasn't who he said he was. Sure, he knew my dad's name and was in the town he used to live in, but how did I know he was really a friend of his? Still, as I was thinking, I couldn't find what words to say next, and in my pause, the man asked again for me to open up. He knocked on the door again, a little harsher. His voice grew less kind and more demanding. I took a few steps from the door, backing away.
Kid, open the door. You gonna let me die out here in the cold? That what your father would want from you.
My heart began pounding as I dug into my backpack for my hunting knife. The man continued hitting the door and yelling subtle threats, discarding the fake identity of being a kind, harmless friend. This went on for much longer than I could keep track of. It felt like it never ended, some continuous nightmare. But suddenly, the man punched the door in anger, and it was followed by the sound of his footsteps walking away, going back into the woods. I stayed up all night, mind racing as I waited in fear. But when the sun came up, and with no signs of him around, I hurriedly packed my bag and ran from the cabin. I got really lucky, finding my car untouched, still well hidden behind the crumbling gas station. I fled from the town and drove non-stop back home. I was hoping with that trip I'd get some answers, or come to terms with everything, but honestly, I'm just left with more questions. I realized I never even really knew why my dad moved away from there. I guess I assumed it was because the town was dying off and everyone else was leaving, but now I think there was probably more to it, and maybe there were other reasons that he'd never brought me back to his cabin. I don't know why that man was still around there, or what he really wanted from me, or how he even knew my dad at all. But something tells me he didn't have any good intentions that night. Had I let my emotions get the better of me and opened the door to invite him in, I genuinely don't think I ever would have made it out of that town. I'd gotten home from work at 9:30 this night and made a quick bowl of cereal for dinner, then went right to my room where my gaming setup was to stay up late and game with the boys. They all worked later shifts too, and I guess were running a bit late, so I sat there and finished my food, then started gaming without them while I waited for them to get online. In the middle of a game, my phone started ringing. I checked it, thinking it was one of my friends, but it was just some random number. I let it ring through, but just a few minutes later, my phone rang again, and it was the same number. I actually found this to be really weird, because usually scam calls don't call immediately, twice in a row. At least, not from the same number. I declined it, but as you could have guessed, they called back right away for a third time. Figured there was no way this was a scam, and had to be a friend using a different phone or something. I picked it up, but didn't say anything at first, waiting for them to speak. But after a few seconds of silence, I said hello. Still, no one responded. I knew it wasn't a dead line though, because I could hear wind in the background. Someone was definitely on the other end of the line. I hung up after 15 seconds, getting kinda creeped out. A few minutes later, my buddies got online, and of course the first thing I asked them was who was messing with me. At first, they pretended like it was them, but they were clearly just joking around, because they actually had no idea what I was talking about. They agreed it did sort of seem like a prank call, but at the same time, what kind of prank is it just to call and not say anything? We left it unknown and just started gaming. Oddly, as soon as I was on call with my buddies, the calls stopped coming in. Couple hours went by, and I'd entirely forgotten it ever even happened. At 2 a.m., we finally decided to call it for the night. We hung up the call, and I stayed at my desk for a minute, when suddenly I felt my phone vibrate. I looked over and saw it was a text. Before even unlocking my phone, I saw the text was from the same number that was calling me, and that it was a picture. I opened my phone and clicked on the image. My stomach tightened, and I could feel the blood rush from my face. It was a picture of me gaming at the desk, taken from right behind me just moments ago. I spun around and looked. No one was there. The only slight relief I got was seeing the window right there, and thinking that at least whatever the hell this picture was, it likely wasn't taken from someone inside my house. I hurried up to the window and looked outside. There wasn't anyone in sight. I made sure the window was locked, then closed the blinds. I went back to my desk, still feeling really unsettled as I stared at the picture still up on my phone. I knew how serious and insanely creepy this was. I saved the image and quickly sent it in the group chat with my friends, praying it was somehow one of them pranking me. But none of them even joked this time. They were all telling me to get out of there or call the cops. I felt my heart start pounding as I quietly opened my bedroom door and looked out into the rest of my home. It was real quiet. For some reason, I really wanted to check the rest of the house and make sure the whole place was secure before calling the police, just in case I was in immediate danger. But I barely even made it down the hallway before looking around the corner and seeing the front door. It was wide open. I don't know how, but somehow it was like I knew that someone was just around the corner from me, and I instantly sprinted back to my room and locked the door. Immediately, footsteps came from down the hallway, but he walked slowly, stepping right up to the other side of the door, and then knocked on it. I saw the door handle move, then he knocked a few more times. He never spoke a word. I started a call with the police, but this whole thing didn't last more than 30 seconds. The man behind the door suddenly backed away, and I'm assuming just left the house. A few officers came by and did their investigation, but I didn't get the answers I hoped for. The number he called and texted with was a burner phone, didn't link to a name or anything, and I never actually saw the man, or had even a single hint as to who it was, or why any of it happened. Even now, I can't help but get paranoid sometimes, because what's stopping him from coming back and doing the same thing again? Or something even worse. I'm 26 and live in a townhome in the far suburbs of a small city. I work closing shifts, usually getting out at 10 or 11 p.m., and spend most of my time at home staying up late and gaming all night with my buddies. It was sort of the same thing over and over every day. But a couple months ago, I was having a pretty stressful week at work, and wasn't in the mood to really hang out with my buddies that night, or even hop online with them. But I also couldn't sleep. I stayed up until 2 a.m. being bored and watching YouTube, before deciding to take a break and go for a walk. I didn't go for many walks, although every time I did, I always found it to be calming and enjoyable, so I don't know why I didn't go more often. Especially at night when nobody else was out. It felt like I had the whole town to myself, which in this context sounds a bit eerie, but I liked it. Or at least I used to. I grabbed a hoodie and locked up my place, then started walking. I had no plans of how long or far I'd go, but I started out by going the way I typically went, which left the townhomes area and went into the neighborhood with regular houses. None of us living out here had it great though, so all the houses were older and not so special, and mostly crowded together. Still better than walking around the townhomes, though. As I walked, it felt like the whole town was asleep. Every house was dark and quiet, and there weren't any sounds at all. For the first little while, I found it very peaceful, just what I needed to de-stress. But as I continued walking down the street, I realized I hadn't ever turned. Like I'd just been walking straight the whole time, which brought me even further to the outskirts. And the street very abruptly turned into a thinner road, leading to much more spread out houses in a very wooded area. Since none of their houses had lights on, except for the occasional porch light, I couldn't even really see them, as they were so well hidden in the trees, past the dim lights above the road. It was a much different vibe than where I was just walking, but I was interested enough to keep going. I got maybe half a mile in, when suddenly I heard a scream. It was a male voice, and it wasn't a scream like they were calling for help. It sounded more like a scream to get someone's attention. It was hard to say for sure though, and with no other noises, their voice echoed through the whole forest, almost sounding like it was coming from all directions. I stopped after hearing it, and didn't see anything. After 30 seconds of waiting, I continued walking. Didn't know what that was, but I knew I'd never be able to figure it out, so I just didn't bother even trying to. Even aside from the scream I heard, the street I was walking down gave me a slightly uneasy feeling the further I went down it. The streetlights felt like they got dimmer and further apart, and the houses that I could see looked a lot older and more deteriorated. They looked neglected and honestly not even lived in. Even the road was getting more disheveled, like no one ever used it anymore. I knew this side of town wasn't in the best shape financially. I mean, even I was broke, like everyone else, but I didn't know this section existed. The more I looked at all of it, the more I started to think it really was a fully abandoned neighborhood, which made me really uncomfortable walking around there in the middle of the night. And then I heard that scream again. It was almost the same as the last one, but it sounded closer, and I was almost sure it was from behind me. I stopped and turned around. The streetlights barely lighting up the road I just came from, and the lack of any other sounds, made me really unsettled. Every little movement in the dark would make me think it was someone out there. I knew in the moment I was getting paranoid, and I should just leave. I didn't know how far the road continued, or where it led to, or if it even looped back to my neighborhood, so I knew it would be best just to go back the way I came from. The only problem was whatever the screaming was that I kept hearing. Still, I turned back. My eyes stayed locked on the road as I walked quickly, trying to get out of the wooded area as fast as possible. I made it a couple minutes down before I suddenly heard the scream again, but it was behind me, just where I came from. Whoever it was, I must have walked past them, which means they must have been hiding in the woods. When I turned and looked, I saw a man on the road. He was wearing all black or dark clothes and was walking toward me. I only looked for a second before turning and continuing to hurry down the road. Something about all this wasn't adding up, and if I just stood there and looked at him for too long, I had a feeling something really bad could end up happening. I turned to look several times after that, and despite seeing him walking toward me before, every other time I looked, he wasn't there. Begged the question of where the hell did he go? Maybe he saw me and turned around himself, not wanting to look like he was following me. I thought it'd make sense considering the sort of creepy area we were in. Whatever was going on, I didn't care to stay and find out. I moved quickly, finally making it out of that strange area and back to where all the homes were. It wasn't all that comforting though, still feeling the eerie sense of being alone. Or maybe it was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I eventually made it back to my townhouse. I don't know if that walk was the stress reliever I was hoping for, but I was just glad to be away from that creepy area, and whoever was screaming out there. I went to the kitchen and got some water and a snack, then sat at the table for a minute to catch my breath. And that's when I heard a shuffling sound outside the front door, and then a sudden heavy knock. I instantly got up from the table and as quietly as possible walked up to the front door. I first put my ear against it to listen, then I looked out. I didn't have my porch light on, so it was basically pitch black, and all I could see was a dark figure standing there. After a few seconds, I thought I could make out that they were for sure wearing dark clothing, and so I was nearly positive it was the same guy I saw for a moment during my walk. He'd followed me home. I got my phone out and backed away as I called 911, trying not to speak too loud. Honestly, I wanted the guy to stay out there long enough for the cops to make it, and that way hopefully I'd get some answers, because now I was really starting to question the screams that I'd been hearing out in the woods. The man outside the door knocked 5 or 6 times while I was on the phone before it went quiet, and eventually I went back to the door and looked, and he was gone. When the officers showed up, they asked questions and stuff, but nothing came of it. I mentioned the screams, and although they thought it was strange, they didn't dig any deeper into it. I don't think I slept at all that night. And while that was mostly the end of everything eventful, over the course of the next month, I kept waking up to knocks at the front door. Loud, disturbing knocks. But by the time I could get down there and look, nobody was ever there. It's been a while since his last visit, but I still feel a bit paranoid. I don't know what was going on in that wooded area, who was screaming, or what the man wanted. All I can say is I know in my gut that I was close to being part of something really awful that night.